and was cycling through the various surveillance devices, listening to and watching the feeds coming from the Inferno on a small handheld LCD screen. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Yeah," Sai said, breathing a sigh of relief. "Everything's fine." Their gamble had paid off. Soon they would know everything there was to know about Milan Verdi and the Dark Fates.
Chapter 58. Justine and I left Vatican City and took stock at the Ristro San Pietro, a cafe and restaurant with seats on the sidewalk that offered a stunning view of the Dome of St. Peter's across Via di Porta Cavalieri. The south side of the street, where we were sitting, was lined with modern apartment blocks, and the north side, across the wide four-lane road, featured buildings influenced by French colonial architecture and the imposing dome of the Grand Church. The cafe was busy with tourists, but we managed to get a table out front. Rather than being an irritation, the busy road beside us was a reminder that we were at the beating heart of one of the most vibrant cities on Earth. "So, we have an assassin connected to a street gang that's tied in with a powerful secret society?" Justine asked. I nodded. "And they've been killing priests?" she went on. "A Rome prosecutor, the first victim we were aware of, Father Brambilla, and they tried to kill Matteo Ricci while he was being held in jail?" I nodded again. "And in each of those instances, they made the deaths look like an accident or from natural causes." "Apart from Fathers Brambilla and Carlos, who were shot," Justine noted. "So they're the odd ones out. Their deaths mean something different." "Yes," I agreed, sipping from my rich roasted double espresso. "Here's the thing. Matteo said someone tried to kill him. In a police station. Well, police headquarters, in fact." "Which means it was someone with access to his cell," Justine remarked. "Or someone with the connections to gain access." "Exactly," I said. "Come on." I waved for a waiter, paid the bill, and hailed a cab heading east along Via di Porta Cavalieri. "Via di San Vitale," I told the driver, as Justine and I settled on the back seat. "If Father Vito is right, and the Jerusalem Cross marks the rise of a successor to Propaganda Due, we can't trust anyone," she said, as we crossed Ponte Principe Amedeo Savoia Aosta over the Tiber. "Propaganda Due infiltrated every section of Italian society. Its successor will almost certainly have done the same." I nodded. We'd both done some initial research into the post-war group, and it was indeed a powerful underground network. Any organization modeled on it would be extremely dangerous. Propaganda Due had counted government ministers, police chiefs, mob bosses, financiers, press barons, and industrialists among its members. A similar group in today's social and political landscape, with a mix of wealth and power, plus the ability to manipulate the media offered by new technology, would be formidable. The taxi deposited us outside police headquarters 15 minutes later. Justine and I went inside and asked to speak to Mia Esposito. We were told to wait and sat down in the busy lobby, watching the comings and goings of Roman justice. Tourists and locals came in to file complaints, suspects presented themselves for interview, and harried lawyers bustled in and out of the building, barely seeming to pause for breath as they chatted rapid fire into their phones. When Esposito finally came out to see us, she looked just as harassed as one of the defense lawyers we'd been watching. "I can't give you much time, Mr. Morgan," she said. "My superiors are concerned your colleague may attempt to take his own life again. They want him moved somewhere more secure, but his attorney is challenging our authority." "Matteo didn't," Justine began, but I interrupted her. "We won't take much of your time, Inspector," I assured her. "In fact, we just want to know who the duty officer was when Matteo was found in his cell. We'd like to ask him or her a few questions about the events leading up to the discovery." "Bernardo Baggio was the duty officer," Esposito replied. "Can we talk to him?" Esposito shook her head. "He isn't in today. He must be ill or something." "Ispetrite Esposito," one of the officers behind the desk called out, beckoning her over. "Excuse me," Esposito said before walking toward him. "Jack," Justine said, nudging me. I followed her eye line and saw 4 uniformed police officers come through the door that led to the interview rooms and back offices. The cops' interest in me was unmistakable. They fixed me with gazes that ranged from hostile to predatory. Despite their feigned nonchalance, it was clear they were fanning out, trying to block my path to the door. I looked over at the reception desk to see Esposito conferring with one of the duty officers. He was watching me with narrowed, suspicious eyes. "I don't like this," I told Justine. "Neither do I," she agreed. "Let's go." "Mr. Morgan," Esposito said, turning to us. "I need to talk to you." The shift in her demeanor was unmissable. Harried cop had been replaced by hunter. "Come on," Justine said, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the exit. "Mr. Morgan," Esposito yelled, and when it was clear we weren't going to listen, she shouted, "Stop! Arrestate quell'uomo!" I didn't need to understand Italian to know she had just ordered my arrest, because all 4 cops sprang toward me, barking out commands. "Run!" Justine yelled, pushing me toward the exit, while she stayed behind to slow down my pursuers. "Go, Jack, run!" Bewildered, heart pounding, fearful of what might happen to me if I was taken into custody, I did exactly as she said. I ran. Chapter 59. I burst out of the main doors and immediately collided with 2 officers coming through the arch. I reacted instinctively, pushing one into the wall opposite. I knocked him out by slamming his head against the stone. The other tried to grab me, but I ducked and slipped free from his grasp, delivering a jab and right cross that knocked him flat on his behind. I heard shouts behind me and the sound of heavy footsteps. I ran on, leaving the injured officers in my wake. Outside, I dodged a passing car as I sprinted across the street, hearing shouts behind me as more police officers joined the chase. I glanced over my shoulder. A group of 4, led by Mia Esposito, were racing after me. I ran past the dilapidated buildings opposite police headquarters before turning left and sprinting south along Via Genova. There was more traffic here, but the sidewalk was quiet. I made good progress to the next intersection. I burst onto Via Nazionale, beside a guest store, and found myself surrounded by pedestrians strolling in the afternoon sun. I had to dodge and weave around them as I turned left and headed east along the busy street. My pursuers were forced to do the same, but there were more of them, and they caused consternation and chaos as they chased me. I ran across the street, picking my way through a line of traffic heading west, and sprinted along the sidewalk before turning right down Via Venezia. There was a mother and baby store on the corner of this narrow cobbled street, lined with apartment buildings. And just beyond the store was a stone feature, set into the front of the neighboring block, a facade that decorated the first floor. The stones were about 1 foot tall and stacked like an asymmetric ladder. I realized it would be an easy climb to an open window visible on the 2nd floor and sprinted to the foot of the column. I grabbed the first stone, which had been hewn from some kind of volcanic rock. It was rough and solid, great for climbing, and whoever had designed the building had left a gap between the first stone column and the rising arch that curved over the adjacent window. So I was able to apply lateral pressure with my left foot to make me more secure and accelerate my climb. I made it to the windowsill on the 2nd floor as the cops ran into the mouth of the street. They yelled as I thrust myself in at the open window. I didn't know why they wanted me, but I wasn't going to make the mistake of finding out. I fell into a small kitchen where an old lady was warming milk on a stove. She cried out and said something very fast, but I didn't stop and ran through her apartment to the front door. I opened it and raced into the corridor beyond. My lungs were burning, my arms aching from the climb, and my legs were sore, but I kept going. The corridor beyond was laid with cheap gray carpet, and the walls covered by peeling floral paper. I ran past a dozen apartments before I reached the stairwell at the end. When I burst through the door, I heard commotion below me and looked over the guardrail to see Mia Esposito leading her squad of officers in pursuit of me. "Mr. Morgan, stay where you are." No chance, I thought, as I bounded up the stairs to the next floor. I ran through the stairwell door into a corridor much like the one below. I sprinted along the old carpet, past a dozen apartments to the door at the end. I burst through to find a twin corridor, the common area of the second wing of this apartment block. I rushed for an elevator lobby, aware of pounding footsteps and shouts behind me, and turned left through a door marked Scala next to an image of stairs. I ran into a stairwell and started down, jumping 3 or 4 at a time. I raced down 2 flights to the ground floor, and when I burst through into the lobby, saw 2 uniformed officers coming toward me, batons in hand. Without breaking stride, I grabbed an ancient dust-covered bronze pillar ashtray and swung it at one of the officers, who didn't react in time and took the full force of the blow. It knocked him down. The second cop tried to parry the blow with his baton, but the pillar caught him with enough force to drive the weapon into his face, knocking him out. I dropped the ashtray and flew through the lobby, reaching the street as Esposito led her team of cops through the stairwell door. "Stop!" she yelled, surveying the men I'd incapacitated. "You're only making it worse for yourself." I doubted that somehow. My colleague had ended up in hospital after being taken into police custody, and there was no way I was giving whoever was behind this the chance to reach me in the same manner. I ran into the street and tried to flag down a car, but it didn't stop. I sprinted south to the corner of Via Palermo, where I saw a motorcyclist getting on his dirt bike. I raced toward him. The surprised man caught sight of me too late. I yanked him off his vehicle, jumped on, started the ignition, and when the engine roared to life, kicked into first gear and shot away, narrowly avoiding the grasping hands of Esposito and her colleagues. Her cries for me to stop rang in my ears until they were lost against the sound of the speeding bike and the clamor of the city. Chapter 60. I destroyed my SIM card and dropped my cell phone in a drain on Via Napoli, a few blocks away from police headquarters. 5 minutes later, I ditched the motorbike in an alleyway behind Via Urbana. I couldn't run the risk of keeping my phone with me. Even switched off and with the counter-surveillance Mobot had installed, she'd always said there was still a chance a savvy hacker or law enforcement agency would be able to use it to find me. And that was a risk I couldn't afford to take. It could put my life in danger, and not just mine, but those of the people I cared for. The situation was one of the reasons I hadn't wanted Justine, Sai, and Mobot to come to Rome. They were on the front line now, and were very much at risk. I moved through the city on foot and bought a pair of mirrored sunglasses and a Roma baseball cap from a souvenir shop. Looking every inch the tourist, I walked the streets, taking a winding route to the Colosseum. The surrounding streets were full of restaurants and bars heaving with people. The groups spilling out of these places onto the street and the tourists taking in the sights gave me plenty of cover, and I wasn't worried about any of these good-time folk turning me into the law. Even if my details had been publicized, these people were the least likely in the city to pay attention to the news. After wandering around for a while, considering my next move, I found a computer store on Via de Capocci, where there were a couple of internet terminals for rent by the hour. The sales assistant, a 20-something woman with long curly dark hair and an uneven smile that suggested she saw tragedy in every joke and comedy in every disaster, showed me to one of the old terminals in the back of the store. They were dusty and didn't look as though they'd been used in a while, which wasn't surprising in the age of cell phones and ubiquitous Wi-Fi. The assistant returned to the counter at the front of the store and left me to sit through 15 minutes of software installations and upgrades when I switched on the machine. Finally, with the air in the street outside cooling to the early evening's gentle warmth, I was able to log into Private's secure virtual network and safely access our comm server. I sent an instant message to Justine, Mobot, and Sai, and it was Mobot who answered first. Mobot.
Where are you?
Me. I don't want to say. It could compromise you. Why are the police trying to arrest me? Mobot.
They say there's new video evidence that implicates you in the death of Father Diaz.
Me. That explains it. Is Justine okay? I left her at the station. Here, Justine joined the chat. Justine.
I'm fine.
The cops held me for an hour, but I cooperated and pointed out I wasn't even in Rome when Father Carlos was killed. So Gianna Bianchi forced them to release me.
Me. Good. I'm gonna have to stay hidden until this blows over. I'm a risk to you all. Aiding and abetting won't help anyone. Justine.
Do you have money?
Me. A little under $2,000. Enough for a hotel for a few nights. Justine.
Gianna Bianchi is putting pressure on Esposito to reveal the evidence the police claim to have on you. I was thinking of involving the embassy.
Me. Good idea. Let me know if you learn anything.
Justine. Will do.
Mobot.
Stay safe.
Justine.
Love you.
Me. Love you too. Sai entered the chat. Sai. Love you too. Me. I'm taken. I'll be in touch as soon as I can. Sai sent a smiley face emoji before I logged off. I wiped the computer's history and shut down the machine before leaving to find somewhere safe to spend the night.
Chapter 61. Justine slipped her phone into her purse and tucked it into the gap between the table and the bed. Mobot and Sai were in the living room of the grungy little apartment above the cell phone store, watching surveillance footage of the Inferno bar. But Justine hadn't been able to concentrate since Jack's disappearance. She had been taken into police custody for a while, not arrested, but assisting with their inquiries, and once she'd been released, had spent her time checking the secure message server, praying Jack would get in touch. Contact had been brief, but it gave her the most important thing of all: reassurance that he was safe. She'd known why he'd run. Matteo Ricci was in hospital after spending time in police custody, and given what they already knew about this investigation, they couldn't trust anyone, including the cops. Justine checked herself in the mirror. Her red floral-patterned dress was lightweight, perfect for the warm Rome evening. She hadn't been crying, but the color had drained from her face under the strain of the situation. She looked distressed, but not distraught, and in any case had no reason to be embarrassed. Her colleagues in the other room know her better than anyone other than Jack. She couldn't hide anything from them, even if she wanted to. She stepped into the living room and found Mobot on the couch with her laptop on her knees. Sai was at the small dining table in front of his machine. "Good news about Jack," Mobot observed, and Justine nodded. "I don't know," Sai said. "I'm kind of sad he doesn't love me back." Justine smiled. "You never were any good at reading the room. Do you think now is the appropriate time for humor?" "He's in forensics. You should hear his dead body jokes," Mobot said. Sai's smile fell, and he lowered his head in contrition. "I'm sorry, Justine. Just trying to lighten the mood." She scowled at him and then broke into a smile. "Like I'm going to bust your chops over that. You're a sucker, Seymour Kloppenberg." "Damn," Sai grinned. "You got me." "You going to reach out to the embassy?" Mobot asked. Justine nodded. "I'm going to call in a favor from a friend. You got a burner I can use?" She was referring to a disposable phone that hadn't been used before and was untraceable. Mobot nodded and got to her feet. She walked to one of the flight cases near the kitchen and rooted around. "How's the surveillance going?" Justine asked. "Nothing yet," Sai replied, twisting his screen so she could see the video program cycling through feeds from various cameras they'd placed in the Inferno. "Just a bunch of metalheads spending their whole time getting drunk." "Try this one," Mobot said, tossing Justine a cell phone. She activated the phone's keypad and dialed a number she'd committed to memory. "Yes," a voice said. It sounded small and distant. "The secretary, please," Justine responded. "It's Justine Smith." "Hello, Ms. Smith," a familiar voice said a moment later. Justine recognized the speaker as Eli Carver, U.S. Secretary of Defense. He was a fan of Private and owed Jack a few favors. "I'm in the middle of something." "Golf?" she asked. "NATO summit," he replied coolly, "but I'd rather be golfing." "How can I help?" "We're in Rome. Jack is in trouble." "Mr. Morgan sure does get around," Carver remarked. and he has a knack for getting in trouble with all the wrong people. What can I do to help him get back on the straight and narrow? I need to talk to the ambassador here, see if we can access evidence the cops claim to have against Jack. Rome is Emily Carter, Carver remarked. I'll make an intro. One of my people will contact you when it's done. You can reach me at, Justine began, but Carver cut her off. We know how to reach you, Ms. Smith. We know how to reach everyone. He hesitated. I'm sorry. I didn't mean that to come out as sinister as it sounded. We'll contact you, Ms. Smith. Say hi to Jack for me. Carver hung up. All good? Mobot asked. Justine nodded.
Chapter 62. I spent the night in a dive hotel that was one notch above derelict. There were rodent droppings in the corridor, damp and mold on the walls, and rot everywhere. But it was the kind of place that took cash, didn't ask for ID, and couldn't afford to probe too deeply into the backgrounds of its motley clientele. I was sharing the building with drug dealers and sex workers and a selection of street criminals. The room was shabby, but the bed wasn't too bad. I managed to get a decent night's sleep despite my worries. I woke soon after dawn, dressed in new clothes I'd bought the previous evening, jeans and a Rome t-shirt. My shades and baseball cap completed my enthusiastic tourist look. I was on the street at 6:15 a.m., walking along Via di Porta Maggiore, an ugly road situated between the railroad tracks and an old industrial park. I passed other low-cost hotels and hostels, the run-down buildings that housed them all covered in graffiti. The neighborhood was still in the process of waking up, and I didn't have to avoid too many people as I headed south. An hour later, I was outside the headquarters of La Repubblica on Via Cristoforo Colombo. The newspaper was located in a business district south of the city center, where broad avenues and parkland combined to create a sense of space. Via Cristoforo Colombo was a wide road lined with low-rise office blocks, open-air parking, and mature trees. I stood on a grassy square in the shadow of a tall fir and watched the entrance of the building opposite. I'd no idea whether Fatima would show, but I was prepared to wait until lunchtime. If she didn't come into the office by then, I would track her down off-site. Thankfully, I saw her drive her Volkswagen into the lot in front of the building a little after 8 a.m. She stepped out of the car wearing white linen trousers and a red blouse. I hurried toward her as she wove her way through the parked cars and walked over to the newspaper building. There was a security guard in the lobby and other staff filing through the entrance. "Don't overreact," I whispered as I took her arm. She glanced at me and spoke through gritted teeth. "Are you crazy? Do you have a death wish coming here?" "Why?" We kept walking south, past the entrance to the building, and she took her phone from her purse. She held the device in front of me, and I saw my own face on screen. "This footage was released this morning. Authorities say it implicates you in the murder of Father Carlos Diaz." My stomach wrapped itself in knots as I watched a video clip of me, taken from inside Chiesa Santa Maria dei Miracoli, the twin church we'd fled to through the secret tunnel. The footage must have been shot by a security camera, and in fact showed me trying to help Father Carlos. In the absence of context, though, it did look as though I might be trying to kill him. "You know I didn't hurt him," I said, suddenly aware of all the faces around us. I studied them for flashes of recognition. "It's a setup." "Of course," Fatima replied. "But you come to Rome's best newspaper when your face is plastered all over the front page? Someone is going to recognize you." "I didn't know," I said, feeling very exposed. "Then if you didn't know, why are you here?" she asked. "If it's not about Father Carlos's murder, what do you want?" "I need to find the cop who was on duty the night Matteo was supposed to have tried to take his own life," I said. "His name is Bernardo Baggio. I need to speak to him." "At police headquarters?" Fatima asked in disbelief. "Of course not," I replied, ignoring her mischievous smile.
Not in the circumstances. And besides, last time we checked, he hadn't showed up for his shift. I'll see what I can do. There's a little cafe around the corner, next left, about 200 meters along. Wait for me there. I nodded, and she left me. I watched her head into the newspaper building, hoping I was right to trust her.
Chapter 63. Ambassador Emily Carter had a large office on the top floor of the U.S. Embassy in Rome, a beautiful imperial-style building located in immaculately manicured gardens dotted with high palm trees. It was on the Via Veneto near the Villa Borghese Park. It was a magnificent setting in which to work. Justine admired the gardens and surrounding buildings through the floor-to-ceiling windows that spanned one side of Carter's office. Justine sat on a severe contemporary leather couch next to Mobot, and both of them kept shifting position, unable to get comfortable. Justine could see her colleague squirming and couldn't resist a smile. "What?" Mobot asked indignantly. "Who designed this thing? And who even buys something like this?" "That would be me," Emily Carter said. She was standing in the doorway leading to her executive assistant's office, and neither Justine nor Mobot had noticed her enter. "Sorry," Mobot said. "It's been a difficult night." "Don't apologize," Carter replied. "I was kidding. It came with the office, probably chosen by my predecessor as a statement piece. I hate it, but I've been so busy I haven't gotten round to remodeling." Justine took an instant shine to the 51-year-old former technology executive who'd agreed to lead the president's diplomatic mission in Rome. Emily Carter was charming, polished, funny, and intelligent. Her lightweight green tea dress would have been regarded by some as too casual for an ambassador, but to Justine it spoke of having enough self-confidence to ensure her own comfort over outdated convention. Carter took a seat in an armchair that matched the couch. "Sorry I was late," she said. "Local situation briefing." "Intelligence? Maybe a background briefing on us?" Mobot remarked, and Carter smiled. "Maureen Roth and Justine Smith of Private," she said. "What can I do for you?" "Our colleague Jack Morgan," Justine began, but Carter interrupted her. "Hero of Moscow and Beijing. Got himself into trouble here in Rome from what I've seen." "Yes," Justine replied. "He didn't do what the police are accusing him of." "Kill a priest?" Carter suggested. Justine hesitated. "Are you trying to test us, Ambassador? Because this doesn't feel like a friendly welcome." Carter smiled. "Do either of you sail?" "I do. The best way to get to know a crew is to sail with them in difficult conditions. Fair weather doesn't show you a person's character. Choppy waters reveal the truth." "Conditions here are already tough without any extra games," Mobot said. "And I've already learned so much," Carter replied. "So, tell me what I can do for you." "We'd like to know what the police have on Jack. We've seen the footage released to the media, and knowing him as we do, it's clear he was trying to save the man's life," Justine said. "They must have something else on him." Carter thought for a moment. "That's a reasonable request for any American citizen. Justice and due process. I'd make representations for anyone, but for Jack Morgan, I'll make them at the highest level. Eli Carver speaks well of him. We'll challenge the narrative, see if we can get hold of whatever they've got. Cast Rome police onto those choppy waters." Justine sat back and breathed a sigh of relief. It seemed her first instincts had been good, and Emily Carter was someone she could trust to do the right thing.
Chapter 64. Fatima found me an hour after we'd parted. I waited in a pedestrianized strip that ran down the center of the avenue, opposite the little cafe she'd suggested as a meeting place, loitering in the shade of an old plane tree. It wasn't that I didn't trust Fatima, but I was being careful and had no idea who she might inadvertently talk to or if she was being watched. I saw her walk along the sidewalk past shops, restaurants, and bars, and she went into the cafe. I checked the street behind her to ensure she wasn't being followed, and moved through the narrow strip of parkland, crossing the road to meet her as she came out.
"Being careful?"
she asked. "Wouldn't you be?" I countered.
"I probably would have left Rome by now,"
she confessed.
"Someone is making a play to either put you out of commission or get you somewhere they can reach you."
"To put me out of commission permanently," I suggested. She nodded slowly. "I'm not easily intimidated," I said.
"I can see that,"
she replied.
"I found Bernardo Baggio's address. He lives at Balduina. It's a suburb in the northwest, about a 40-minute drive from here."
We hurried back to the parking lot around the corner, got in Fatima's Volkswagen, and started our journey through the city. She kept us away from the center and took us on a route that swung west through Gianicolense. She was quiet throughout, clearly uneasy, and every time we stopped at an intersection, her eyes darted busily around. I guessed she was scanning our surroundings to make sure no one recognized me. I was in my cap and shades, but my face was all over the news, so I remained equally alert. We arrived at Via Eutropio just after 10 a.m. The neighborhood featured a mix of contemporary apartment blocks of varying architectural styles, all set back from the road in private gardens that were full of mature trees. Ivy covered the exterior walls, and a number of residents had garden balconies, adding to the impression of greenery. The area looked like a lovely place to live. Bernardo Baggio's building was a 5-story contemporary block, set behind a high wall and a stand of mature trees. The apartments all had large balconies that overlooked the gardens. Fatima parked in front of the main gate, and we got out of the car and walked toward the entrance.
"How do you want to do this?"
Fatima asked. "You happy to say you're doing a story on Matteo?" I asked. "That you've been told it was a suicide staged by someone who had access to the cell?" She nodded. "Then let's play it straight. See how well he copes under pressure," I suggested, as we went inside. Chapter 65. Bernardo Baggio's building looked to be 20 or 30 years old. Modern, but with enough time elapsed since its construction to have acquired some character. The lobby had a marble tile floor, painted plaster walls, and an Art Deco staircase that ran through the heart of the building, creating an atrium topped by a glass roof. Everything was clean and well-maintained, and the interior garden of potted plants added to the impression that the residents took pride in their building. There was a sign for an elevator toward the back of the building, but Fatima and I took the stairs. "You know we're going to see a cop?" I asked as we climbed. She looked blank. "Aren't you worried about being caught with a fugitive?"
"I'll just tell them you took me hostage,"
she said with a mischievous grin. I chuckled as we reached the second-floor landing. We walked through a set of ornately decorated doors into a small lobby with corridors running off it in both directions. A sign informed us apartment 23 was to our right. We walked along the carpeted corridor, past apartment doors embellished with wooden details of leaves and branches, completing the decorative cornicing. Modern buildings didn't generally expend much effort on decorative touches like these, but here they added a sense of style. We found apartment 23, and Fatima rang the bell. I noticed the door wasn't fully in the frame, and kicked it gently. It swung open. "Hello?" I said. There was no reply, just the stillness of an empty home. I looked at Fatima, who nodded. I went first, senses heightened, alert, and she followed. The birds chirping in the trees and cars passing in the street below were audible through the large sash windows, but there was no other sound in the apartment. The building's fine finish was evident here, too, as we walked along a corridor with high ceilings. The walls were half wood panel, half painted plaster, with molded reliefs adorning them here and there. The kitchen lay to our left and was tidy, apart from some dishes in the sink. Opposite was a dining room, with a long table and 8 chairs, all of which looked unused. Further to our right was a sitting room, comfortably furnished with 2 couches before a television that stood in front of the windows overlooking the street. Further along on the left was a bathroom, and then at the end of the corridor, 2 bedrooms arranged opposite each other. I took the one on the right, and Fatima went into the room on the left. There was a king-size bed, a dresser, bureau, and a built-in closet with mirrored doors. I caught my reflection and removed the cap and opaque shades to reveal a mop of messy hair and tired eyes. I needed a break when this was over, and promised myself I'd go somewhere with Justine. I moved toward the closet and opened one of the sliding doors. I'd seen some grotesque things in my life, but nothing could prevent the gasp of shock I released and the shiver of dismay I experienced when confronted with the body of the man I presumed to be Bernardo Baggio. It was hanging from an electrical cable rigged to a clothes rail. He wasn't even off the ground. His knees were simply bent so that his neck took the full strain of his own weight. If he'd been conscious when he died, he could have stood up at any moment and chosen life. "Fatima, I found him and it's not good. If you come in here, prepare yourself," I said. Moments later, she hurried in and joined me. "Oh my God," she exclaimed. "Poor man." "We need to call," I began, but cut myself off when I noticed a red target marker appear on the back of her head. "Down," I yelled, grabbing her and pushing her to the floor. Chapter 66. There was the quietest of cracks and the tinkling of shattering glass. The bullet hit one of the mirrored closet doors, roughly where Fatima had been standing the instant before. The glass shattered into a spider's web of broken pieces. "Is someone shooting at us?" she asked in disbelief. "Stay here," I said, before crawling round the bed that gave us both cover. I pulled myself along on my forearms, just as I had many years before, crawling through mud during my Marine Corps training, and reached the window. I glanced over the lip of the sill and saw the unmistakable shape of a suppressed sniper's rifle in the hands of a man leaning over the balustrade on the roof of the building opposite. He was scouring the windows of the apartment for any sign of us. He spotted me and let fly a couple rounds. The bullets punched holes in the window as I ducked down. They thudded into the side of the bed. "Count to 50 and then stand up," I said to Fatima, and immediately ducked down again. She glanced over the bed at me and nodded before disappearing from view. I crawled out of the bedroom. When I was safely in the corridor out of sight, I got to my feet and started running. I sprinted through the front door, along the corridor, and bounded down the stairs. I flew through the lobby and burst into the street just in time to see 2 flashes above me as the shooter took aim at Fatima and opened fire. With his attention on her, I ran across the street to the entrance of the building opposite, a modern cream-rendered block. The main entrance was locked, so I pressed all the buzzers. When someone answered, I said DHL and was buzzed in. I ran across a black and white marble checkerboard floor to a bank of 3 elevators and pressed the call button. The doors of the car on my left slid open, and I raced inside and pushed the button for the top floor, number 4. The elevator rose too slowly for someone hunting their would-be killer, but I took the opportunity to steady my breath and was ready the moment the doors opened. I ran into a corridor, headed for the fire door on my right, and burst into a concrete stairwell. I sprinted up, taking the steps 3 at a time, and reached the roof in moments. Breathing heavily, I paused to listen at the door. Based on my rough grasp of the building's layout, I'd worked out that access opened to the rear of the roof. I pushed the bar and eased the door wide before stepping carefully through the gap. I closed the door silently behind me and edged round the stairwell structure until I reached the corner. I craned my neck to see the shooter leaning over the balustrade at the front of the building. He had his back to me and was some 40 feet away. Not far, but a huge gulf for an unarmed man to cross. My only hope was surprise, and that I'd get sufficiently close to make the long-barreled gun impossible to use. I crept forward and made it halfway across when the sound of gravel grinding beneath my feet gave me away. He turned, and I recognized him as one of the many hostile bikers I'd escaped from at the Inferno bar. He was undoubtedly a member of the Dark Fates, sent by Milan Verde to kill us. He had a scar over one eye that ran down his left cheek, close-cut black hair, and a scowl that would have made the devil blush. I sprinted toward him as the shock of seeing me faded, and he swung the rifle round. I dodged the first shot and made it to within striking distance. I parried the gun, sending the second shot wide, and moved in, hurling punches at him. He staggered back, reeling, but quickly recovered. As I came again, he drove the stock of the rifle into my face, dazing me. I lashed out instinctively and connected with something soft, his neck maybe. I heard a clatter, and as my vision returned, saw the rifle abandoned on the rooftop. I glanced over at the stairwell to see the shooter sprint out of sight. With my adrenaline reaching fever level, I raced after him. Chapter 67. The shooter was a blur of black jeans and dark gray t-shirt as he ran down the stairs. I followed him, bounding and bouncing off the walls, closing the gap, but saw him fumbling with his waistband and pressed back against the guardrail when I realized he had a pistol. He waved it in my direction and fired 2 shots that sounded like thunder cracks in the enclosed stairwell. Being at the wrong end of a gun slowed me down. I hugged the wall as I followed him. He reached the ground floor, ran through the stairwell door, and I followed, only to be confronted by the barrel of his gun. He'd ambushed me. I knew the advantage would play to him if I lost momentum, so I ducked as he fired, ignored the loud gunshot and the ringing in my ears, grabbed his outstretched arm and twisted it up and inwards, applying enough pressure to break it. He reacted before the bone cracked, cried out, dropped the gun, kneed me in the gut, and wriggled free. Winded, I picked up the pistol and sucked in breath as I ran after him. He sprinted onto the street and waved down a car, which screeched to a halt as he stepped in front of it. He pulled the unwitting driver, a terrified woman in her 50s, from her seat and jumped into the Alfa Romeo Giulia. I reached the street as he accelerated away and brandished the gun at the driver of a BMW 3 Series that had been forced to stop behind the Alfa. The driver, a man in his 30s, came out scowling, but stepped back as I jumped in. I gunned the engine, and the car roared like an animal as I set off after the shooter. He was reckless, racing along Via Eutropio, past parked cars on either side, before performing a screeching handbrake turn onto Via Appiano, a wider street that was flanked by smaller, more tightly packed apartment blocks. The gunman accelerated, weaving around slower-moving cars, mounting the sidewalk, blasting his horn to urge people to jump clear. He shot beneath a bridge and raced downhill, weaving around a delivery truck. I followed more cautiously, eager not to hurt anyone, but keen to keep within striking distance. The tires screeched as I swerved around the Mercedes, the shocked face of the driver receding a pace in my rearview mirror as the BMW surged forward, chasing the shooter onto Piazza Giovenale, a small square with a playground at its heart. He went round the square the wrong way, dodging oncoming vehicles, and turned left on Via Ugo de Carolis. I heard a bone-crunching crash and slowed as I approached the intersection. I saw the crumpled wreck of the Alfa concertinaed against the back of a garbage truck. The shooter, dazed and disoriented, bleeding from a gash on his head, was tamping down the driver's airbag and struggling to get free of the vehicle. I stopped the BMW, unclipped my seatbelt, and jumped out. The sight of me approaching spurred him on, and he got to his feet, staggered a few steps, and started running along the street, ignoring the shouts of the garbage workers, who were understandably upset by the crash. I followed, pushing through the gang of uniformed men and onlookers, and raced after the shooter. I tucked the pistol in my waistband. There was no way I'd even threaten to use the weapon as an attempt at intimidation when there were so many innocent people around. The shooter was limping, and I was closing the gap between us. He kept glancing back and looked increasingly dismayed and agitated to see me gaining on him. We were approaching the intersection with Via Filippo Nicolai, and a crowd of pedestrians was gathered on this side of the street, poised to go south. The shooter pushed his way through the crowd until he was at the very edge of the crosswalk. He glanced back at me and very deliberately stepped off the sidewalk into the path of a speeding dump truck. Chapter 68. I stood in silence for a moment, reeling at what I'd just seen, while people all around me screamed and backed away from the horror. This was the second member of the Dark Fates to have taken his own life rather than risk being captured. Whatever indoctrination these men had undergone was sufficiently powerful to subvert the most basic human instincts. Survival is at the heart of who we are, and to see a core trait so hideously twisted was deeply troubling to me. Could my own belief system ever be subverted like that? I pulled myself together, and in the moment of calm that followed the scattering of the shocked crowd and the bewilderment of the truck driver and motorists who'd ground to a halt either side of the macabre scene, I ran forward. Under the pretext of checking whether the shooter was alive, I took his wallet and phone from the bloody remains. "He's dead," I yelled as I stood. "Someone call an ambulance." I could already hear sirens and knew that was my cue to leave. I pressed through the crowd reconvening on the sidewalk some distance from the crushed body, and when I broke the edge of the cluster of people, jogged along the street and then retraced my steps to Bernardo Baggio's building, pulling the cap and mirrored sunglasses from my pocket and putting them on. I found Fatima loitering outside, looking lost and uncertain. She brightened when she saw me. "What happened?" "I almost caught him, but he jumped in front of a truck," I replied. "Like the last guy," Fatima remarked. I nodded. Whatever this group is, they've got a real hold on the minds of these men. "What now?" she asked. "I need to contact Mobot. I've got the guy's personal possessions." I produced his wallet and phone. "I need them analyzed. See if we can find out who was giving him orders." "Milan Verde, surely." "I'd like to be certain," I told her. "Where's the nearest internet cafe?" Fatima shook her head. "Are you from the 90s? Use this." She produced a silent circle black phone. I was familiar with the model. Mobot said they weren't completely reliable at preventing tracking and data theft, but combined with private secure network, it would suffice in the circumstances. I used the phone to log into Private's virtual network and access the messaging platform. "Me. I need to meet. Justine." "Where?" "Where should we meet?" I asked Fatima. "Somewhere public with lots of people." "Centro Commerciale Aura," she replied. "It's a shopping mall not far from here." "Me. Centro Commerciale Aura. Food court. 1 hour." "Justine." "Okay." I disconnected, cleared the cache as an extra precaution, and returned the phone to Fatima. "Thanks," I said. "No problem," she replied. "When are we meeting them?" "In 1 hour. The mall should give us plenty of cover." 1 hour later, as Fatima and I walked through the beautiful glass and lattice metalwork entrance to the mall on Viale di Valle Aurelia, I started to regret my decision. There were so many people around, it was impossible to secure early warning of a threat. But I told myself the throng of people would work in my favor too, masking Fata and me, giving us cover from prying eyes. We followed the mass of pedestrians heading along the walkway between the luxury stores, high-end clothing boutiques, and fragrance shops that filled the air with the sweetest scents. Adrenaline flooded my body, heightening my perception as we took the escalator up to the next level. I scanned the eyes of the people around me, particularly those riding the down escalator, but there wasn't the slightest flicker of recognition from anyone. Fatima and I made it to the food court and saw Sai, Mobot, and Justine seated at a large round table next to a luxury bakery and sandwich bar. There was a fire exit behind them. I couldn't imagine the choice of table was accidental. The green door offered a quick escape route. I saw Justine register our arrival and draw Mobot's and Sai's attention to us. Looking back on that moment, I'm not sure whether that was the trigger or whether the cops had simply picked us up as we arrived. But when we got within a few feet of the table, the food court was swarmed by police officers, most of them not in uniform, who'd been seated at adjacent tables. They ran at us, shouting, weapons raised. Mobad got to her feet and walked toward them, saying,
"What the heck is this? What do you guys want?"
She was roughly manhandled and handcuffed, but the distraction bought us a heartbeat's reprieve. I grabbed Fatima and pulled her through the fire door. I ignored the commands to stop. When I glanced over my shoulder, I saw Cy and Justine face down against their table, being handcuffed. Every fiber in me wanted to go to Justine's aid, but Fatima pulled me away.
"Come on," she said. "You can't help her if you're dead."
I nodded and ran after her as she raced down the stairs. Above us, I heard the hammer of footsteps, but we had a decent head start and reached the ground floor quickly. We burst through the fire door, startling two cops who had obviously been given what they thought was the light duty of standing guard by an emergency exit. I grabbed the larger of the two and slammed his head against the door, dazing him. As he fell to his knees, I unclipped his pistol and drew it on his colleague. Fatima spoke in Italian and clearly told the men to lie down, because that's what they did. I heard shouts coming from the stairwell and looked around urgently. I caught sight of an elderly couple walking to their car, a classic sky-blue Peugeot 505, parked in a disabled space. "Come on," I said to Fatima, and we ran over to the man and woman. I grabbed the car keys from the man's hand, and Fatima and I jumped in the beautifully maintained old car before the guy had really registered what had happened. He started yelling as I turned the ignition, and the prone cops got to their feet and staggered towards us, just as the pursuing officers burst out of the fire exit and ran our way. I put the Peugeot in gear, floored the accelerator, and we shot to safety, leaving a dozen angry people yelling in our wake. Chapter 69. Fatima and I abandoned the Peugeot a couple blocks away. Other than the engine enduring a bit of a workout, the car was unscathed, thank goodness. I didn't feel great about the theft, but sometimes doing the right thing under intense pressure involves breaking a few rules. We cut across the grounds of a school, hopped a fence, and saw the number 31 bus heading south along the Via Anastasio II.
"That will take us west out of the city,"
Fatima said, flagging down the vehicle as she ran toward the stop. We climbed aboard, paid the fare, and settled into seats near the back as the bus rolled on. We saw heightened police activity everywhere, patrol cars speeding in the opposite direction, beat officers being mustered to checkpoints, and a helicopter in the sky. We had just driven through an underpass when Fatima's cell phone rang. She pulled it from her purse.
"Unknown number,"
she said, before answering. She listened for a moment.
"Police,"
she whispered.
"They want to know if I'm okay."
I reached over and took her phone. "Fatima Salah is my hostage. I will only release her when my demands are met. I will be in contact soon," I said, before hanging up. I slid the phone down the side of my seat and stood. "Come on," I said.
"My phone,"
she protested. "I'll buy you a new one." I pressed the bell and walked to the exit as the bus slowed. Fatima followed grudgingly.
"Did you really have to do that?"
she asked. "Which bit, the hostage, or leaving your phone?"
"Both,"
she said, as the doors lurched open with a pneumatic hiss. "You gave me the idea," I said. "It absolves you of any wrongdoing, and you know I couldn't let you keep your phone, no matter how secure it's supposed to be." She nodded and sighed as we left the bus.
"What now?"
she asked while the vehicle rumbled away. "I need to get the surveillance gear from the apartment," I said. "No one is watching Milan Verde and the Dark Fates. We have no idea what they're doing. If I can review the footage, I might be able to see who sent that man to kill us at Baggio's apartment."
"I'm guessing the cops followed your friends after Justine was released from custody,"
Fatima remarked.
"So the apartment is probably being watched."
I nodded. "We'll just have to be careful, and maybe a little cunning."
"You're dangerous, Jack Morgan."
"Hold that thought," I responded, hurrying toward a payphone beside a petrol station. I stepped into the booth, swiped a credit card through the slot, and dialed the operator. An automated announcement played in Italian, and I handed Fatima the receiver. She listened and then spoke in Italian. "Who do you want?" she asked me. "Gianna Bianchi," I replied, "the attorney." I heard Fatima repeat the name along with some instructions in Italian. After a short pause, she handed the receiver back to me. There was a ringing tone and a woman's voice said, "Bianchi, avvocatessa." "Gianna Bianchi, please. Tell her it's Jack Morgan." I was connected almost immediately.
"Jack, what's going on? The things they're saying on the news."
"They're not true," I interrupted Gianna. "Someone has done a great job of setting me up. Listen, I need you to do me a favor. My colleagues Seymour Kloppenberg, Maureen Roth, and Justine Smith have just been arrested at Centro Commerciale Aura. Do whatever you can to get them released. They've done nothing wrong."
"Of course,"
Gianna said. "And you should probably let the cops know one of their own is dead. Bernardo Baggio is hanging in his closet. I think it's murder staged to look like suicide."
"Why?"
Gianna asked. "He was on duty the night Matteo was supposed to have tried to kill himself." I could sense her putting the pieces together.
"I'll inform the authorities,"
she assured me.
"What about you? Come in. We'll challenge the accusations."
"Not yet," I replied. "I can't risk what happened to Matteo and Baggio happening to me. I need to take care of a few things." She hesitated.
"I understand, but I have to advise you to turn yourself in."
"You've done that. Now do whatever you can to get my friends out. I'll be in touch."
"Be careful,"
she advised before I hung up. I turned to Fatima.
"Everything okay?"
she asked. I nodded, my mind whirring, my body still charged with adrenaline. Just trying to figure out how we get inside an apartment that is probably under tight police surveillance. Chapter 70. I tried to encourage Fatima to leave me, but she refused to listen, saying she would never bail on a story like this. I couldn't help feeling there was more to it, that there was a sense of honor guiding her, compelling her not to abandon me. It was a sentiment I shared. I'd never abandoned a case. She took me to a tiny basement bar in Poggio del Torino, a neighborhood that lay between the center of Rome and Ostia, and we passed the evening there with a handful of heavy drinkers who spent enough on alcohol to keep the place going. The bar was called Il Tucano and was set beneath a modern apartment block. It was the kind of watering hole where people drank alone and purposefully, determined to achieve oblivion. While I'd hesitate to label strangers alcoholics or problem drinkers, these folks certainly weren't fair weather. Fatima and I sat in a booth in a back corner of the bar, nursing a steady stream of cokes, coffees, and water to ensure the taciturn old barman, who looked as though he'd soaked up many lifetimes of misery, didn't kick us out. No one paid us any mind, and for a while I was able to forget I was a wanted man whose face had been beamed across the airwaves and the internet. "You don't have to do this," I said to Fatima.
"You keep telling me that, and I keep telling you I want to be here."
"You're risking so much," I responded.
"And you?"
she asked.
"Why do you have to be here?"
I hesitated. "I don't," I conceded. "But if I wasn't here, who would find the truth? Who would protect Matteo from wrongful conviction? I can't stand by if there's a chance an innocent man might be jailed." She nodded slowly.
"Do you know what it's like to come to a country as a refugee? To be spat on, told you're inferior, to be abused, ridiculed, told you aren't welcome, that you have no worth?"
I shook my head. I couldn't imagine experiencing any of those things, and was suddenly conscious of the privilege life had granted me.
"It can break a person,"
Fatima said, and I couldn't be sure in the low light of the bar, but I thought her eyes were glistening.
"Or it can build strength. It can teach you to know when the crowd is wrong and when those less fortunate than you need help. Rome is hunting you, Mr. Morgan. And for someone who grew up being marginalized by Rome, this is reason enough for me to stay."
We remained in our booth until the last of the swaying customers staggered out, and the barman finally presented us with the bill shortly after 1 a.m. We stepped onto Viale degli Astri, a wide avenue lined with palm trees and modern apartment blocks, and the warm air hit us along with the echoes of drinkers and diners making their way home along the otherwise quiet streets. We walked through a small park that lay to our east and caught a taxi from an office set in the foot of an apartment block on Viale Don Pasquino Borghi. About 5 minutes into our journey, as we reached the open highway that would take us to the coast, I noticed the driver, a short, stocky man with stubble and the hungry expression of a hyena, kept glancing at me in the rear-view mirror, and every so often his gaze would linger. I could see my face in the mirror, lit up now and again by the headlamps of vehicles coming along the carriageway on the other side of the median.
500,
the driver said at last.
Mi scusi?
Fatima responded.
For a safe journey,
he explained.
It seems a fair price for your friend.
And there it was. His eyes were on me, not because he was a conscientious citizen thinking of turning me in, but because he was calculating how much he could extort for his silence. Fatima said something in Italian. She sounded angry, but I interrupted her. That's a fair price, I said. I'm assuming it buys your silence forever.
That's another 500,
the greedy man replied. I nodded. Okay. 15 minutes later, he pulled to a halt on Via Ottavio, a quiet residential street in Ostia.
1,000,
he said, turning with his hand held out expectantly. The meter says 30 euros, I remarked. He scowled and waved his phone menacingly.
Police.
You know why they're hunting me, I said, leaning forward so my face was inches from his. They say I killed a priest. Go ahead and make the call, Paolo Sacchetto. I gestured at his license displayed on the dash. My friends and I will know exactly where to find you. His bravado crumbled. I handed him 50 euros. A generous tip for such a comfortable ride, I said, before getting out.
Remind me never to cross you,
Fatima said as she joined me on the sidewalk. We waited for the taxi to leave before heading for Via Orazio, 10 minutes away. We walked on arm in arm, playing the part of lovers coming home from a date. As we got closer to the cell phone store, we feigned chit-chat, but were in fact pointing out potential risks to one another.
Van, 20 feet from the store,
Fatima said, touching my arm as though she was telling me how much she loved me. I see it, I replied, and we crossed the street and walked behind the empty market stalls opposite the terrace where the store was located. Fatima was nearest the van and kept her head turned toward me, providing me with good cover so I wasn't easy to see from the vehicle. But by leaning around her briefly, I caught a glimpse of 2 men in the cab, their faces lit by the glow of the gaudy lights in the store window. It's not the cops, I said, surprised by the fact I recognized the men. I know these 2. They were at the Inferno. They're members of the Dark Fates. We walked more quickly and took a left down Via Stefano Cansacchi.
Why aren't the police watching the apartment? Why is it being staked out by gangsters?
Fatima asked. My guess is the Rome police force is even more compromised than we thought, I replied. Someone high up must have told the cops to back off in order to give these guys a clear run. We stopped and turned to look back at the bright lights of the cell phone store. They're going to have at least 1 pair of eyes on the rear of the building too, I said. So I'm going to need you to create a distraction. Chapter 71. Fatima was able to buy almost everything we needed from the cell phone store. She got the 2-liter bottle of soda from a mini-mart down the street, emptied the contents into a drain, and followed the instructions I'd given her. Phone cleaning cloths soaked in lighter fluid, fused lithium cell phone batteries stuck in the bottle with its top cut off, and matches were all it took to create the distraction. I watched her approach the van from the rear, strike a match, and set the device on fire. The cleaning cloths caught instantly, and she shoved the device under the rear wheel, beneath the fuel cap, and ran. The guy in the passenger seat noticed the flames first and alerted his companion. Both men jumped out of the vehicle and ran to the burning device, which wasn't what I'd had in mind because the batteries would be unstable and could explode at any moment. But I took advantage of the distraction and hurried across the street and down the alleyway that led to the metal stairs behind the building. As I glanced over at the van, I saw the passenger hurl the flaming device across the street. It exploded in midair, knocking both men down, shattering nearby car windows and setting alarms ringing. I raced into the darkness of the alley and encountered a man coming the other way. I had no doubt it was a Dark Fates lookout drawn to the explosion. He almost ran into me, but I saw a silhouette against the light beyond the alleyway and swung at him. My fist connected with tremendous force, his own momentum carrying him into the punch, and he groaned and fell instantly. I stepped over him and ran on, reaching the rear of the building. There was no one else around, so I climbed the stairs carefully and found the front door of the apartment ajar. I took a moment to catch my breath and compose myself before creeping inside. The hallway was dark, but there was low light coming from the living room. I moved cautiously and silently toward it. I could hear the sound of chaos rising from the street, car alarms, people shouting, and in the distance, approaching sirens. I didn't have long. When I craned my head round the doorframe, I saw the silhouette of a man at the window, watching the street outside. Sai's and Mobot's computers were on the table and had been connected to a hard drive. I could see status bars on both screens showing the progress of data being downloaded. I moved toward the man at the window, noting the fleur-de-lis tattoo on his forearm that marked him out as a member of Propaganda Tre. He must have sensed me because he turned and tried to pull a gun from his waistband. I rushed forward, blocked his draw, and headbutted him. As he staggered back, I kicked his knee, causing him to hunch over, and drove an uppercut into his chin with so much power his head snapped up and his eyes rolled back before he fell in a heap. I looked out the window to see flashing blue lights rising above the buildings a few streets away. I grabbed Sai's holdall from the bedroom, put the laptops inside along with the hard drive, and then stuffed the bag with all the surveillance gear I could fit inside before slinging it over my shoulder and racing out of the apartment. I ran along the alleyway, avoiding the fallen gang member, and emerged onto the street as the first police car rounded the corner. I went the other way, heading west, and past the two Dark Fates members who were lying on their backs in the road, trying to come to their senses. I walked on as tires screeched behind me. I saw the cop car pull to a halt and the two officers jump out. Behind them came more cars, and locals who had been watching from their windows drifted into the street as the area became a major crime scene.
"Jack,"
Fatima whispered. I saw her hiding in the shadows of a doorway near the intersection with Via Stefano Kansaki. She joined me as I passed, and together we marched to the corner.
"Everything okay?"
she asked, glancing back. I nodded. "I got what we came for," I said, as we hurried into the night. Chapter 72.
"I've never known anyone need a second safe house so quickly,"
Valentina said.
"You're quite a celebrity here in Rome."
I shifted awkwardly as we waited for the Italian hacker's friend, Amr Badawi, to unlock the roll shutter of the warehouse that was to be my new temporary home. "The clever stray is the one who isn't seen," Amr added, and I tried not to take offense at him comparing me to a dog. "Yes," I conceded. "My notoriety is less than ideal, and I'm sorry about your other place."
"Don't worry about it,"
Amr replied, working the rusty lock.
"The police haven't linked anything to the apartment. They think the Dark Fates were planning a hit on someone, and if there was police involvement in letting the gang conduct surveillance, whoever was behind it is not going to come forward with the truth."
Amr managed to force the lock and opened the smaller of two roll shutters at the front of this seemingly deserted warehouse. It was just big enough for people to enter the building, while the larger 20-foot-wide shutter next to it was clearly designed for freight. Hammer switched on the lights as we stepped inside and illuminated a 60 by 100-foot space filled with boxes of LCD screens and other electronics.
"One of the places I keep stock," he explained. "Please don't damage anything."
Fatima gave me a disapproving look as I raised my hands in mock deference. "I won't do anything," I said.
"There's an apartment upstairs. 3 bedrooms, living room, kitchen,"
Hammer said. He handed me the key.
"The lock sticks, but you'll get the hang of it."
"Thank you," I replied.
"As I said before, it's a business arrangement, Mr. Morgan," he responded. "There is no need for thanks. You are a profitable guest. Trouble, but profitable."
Valentina nudged him.
"Don't let Hammer fool you with his hard-nosed persona. He likes helping people, particularly people he likes. He has a big heart."
Hammer smiled bashfully.
"Don't listen to her lies about the size of my heart. But I do hope you'll be safer here, Mr. Morgan."
"Thank you," I told them both.
"I'd do anything for Mobat,"
Valentina said.
"I owe her."
"She's in Rome," I revealed. "In police custody, I think."
"Why? What for?"
"Knowing me," I replied.
"I hope she's okay,"
Valentina said.
"I'll ask around, see if I can find out where she is. Come on, Hammer, let's get out of here before he gets us busted."
They left the warehouse and I closed the shutter, sealing myself and Fatima inside. We were in another part of Ostia, this neighborhood even more run down than the first. I didn't want to invite any trouble, particularly as the entrance could be seen from the road. The warehouse was located on Via dell'Idroscalo, a road that ran through the estuary marshes to the north of Ostia's center, and the building and surrounding industrial state backed onto the river Tiber. 20 minutes later, Fatima and I were in the living room of a musty apartment above the offices at the back of the warehouse. We had a view of the estuary from here and could see the bright lights of buildings on the other side of the river. Fatima sat beside me on a frayed old couch, the floral pattern bleached by the sun. I'd set up Mobots and Sai's computers and was analyzing the hard drive that had been connected up to them. The guy I'd knocked down had been trying to steal data from the machines and was copying the hard drives of both computers, clearly intending to mine them for everything and anything useful. He had a disk wipe program set up and ready to execute. I was relieved he had prioritized the theft, otherwise we'd have lost the surveillance footage being recorded from the devices planted around the Inferno bar. As it was, the footage seemed intact, right up to the moment Milan Verde discovered and destroyed the bugs. There were multiple final shots of angry, hostile members of the Dark Fates finding the cameras, snarling into the lenses and cursing before reaching up to send the transmission dark for the very last time.
"So, they found the cameras,"
Fatima remarked. I nodded. "And the listening devices. Thankfully, the guy wasn't able to wipe the hard drives, so we can see what was recorded while Sai, Mobat, and Justine have been in custody." I set up multiple windows so we could view simultaneous feeds from most of the cameras and started scrubbing back through the footage. It was painstaking work, and my eyes were heavy with tiredness that only pulled at me more as the adrenaline of the night ebbed away. I could sense Fatima's fatigue, but like me, she fought through it.
"There,"
she said, and I followed her pointing finger to see a man in a suit enter the bar. I paused the videos. The time code showed he'd arrived at 2:13 p.m. He looked uncomfortable and out of place. I pressed play, and the videos ran forward simultaneously. It wasn't until the awkward-looking man approached the bar that I saw his face. It was Christian Altmer, Joseph Stadler's executive assistant, the man Justine had flagged as having something to hide. My mind raced, wondering what a respectable banker was doing in the lair of one of the most dangerous gangs in Rome. Chapter 73. Whatever Altmer was doing at the Inferno bar, neither he nor Milan Verde wanted anyone to know about it. The brutal gang leader came in a couple of minutes after Altmer arrived, greeted him like an old friend, put an arm around his shoulders, and shepherded him outside. Milan returned 15 minutes later, alone. There was nothing else in the footage, and for a while Fatima and I puzzled over the incident with Altmer.
You think they're laundering funds through the Vatican bank?
She asked. That's a step up for a street gang, I replied.
Or a step down for a bank,
she countered.
Some institutions are desperate for liquidity, though.
I don't know, I said. But what I do find interesting is that this meeting took place after Mobat, Sai, and Justine were taken into custody. Did they know they were being watched at this point? Were they counting on being able to delete the footage before Justine and the others were released? Fatima shrugged. But I couldn't help feeling the heat of anger building within me. I considered the prospect that someone working for a client might have set us up for arrest, or worse. Fatima stretched.
I'm going to sleep,
she said.
My place is probably too dangerous, so I'll take a bedroom if that's okay.
I nodded. Of course. She got to her feet and headed along the corridor toward the bedrooms. I stared at the image of Altmer, puzzling over the man and his intentions, until finally, in the early hours, bereft of answers, my anger smoldering, I fell asleep. The following morning, I woke on the couch, the computer in sleep mode, the rising sun shining brilliantly through the large windows, the river shimmering beyond. I stood, stretched, and walked along the corridor to the bedrooms. The doors were all open, and there was no sign of Fatima, although the bedclothes in the middle room looked to have been slept in. I heard a noise coming from behind me and crept into the living room to discover her coming in from the main warehouse. She was holding a large paper bag packed with groceries.
I got some breakfast,
she said, placing the bag on the table. She started pulling out juice cartons, pastries, and spreads.
I was thinking about Christian Altmer,
she said.
How would you like the chance to talk to him?
Chapter 74. Rome is full of mysteries that extend beyond the metaphysical into the physical. How did the emperors and senators flee from a siege and escape to their homes in the provinces? Or the old Renaissance families hide from civil unrest? Secret tunnels like the one linking Basilica di Santa Maria in Monte Santo and Chiesa Santa Maria dei Miracoli, the church where Father Carlos had died, run beneath the city like veins, a physical manifestation of the intrigue and mystery that has been the city's lifeblood for centuries. Fatima and I took a taxi from Ostia to Via Angelo Emmo, a busy street a few blocks from the western edge of Vatican City. She led me past shops and offices until we reached the mouth of Via Giovanni Secchi, a narrow side street that bent sharply before running east. We followed it past a line of modern 5-story apartment blocks until we came to a dead end. The street was fringed by thick greenery, bushes and trees packed tightly together beneath the ancient Fornaci Viaduct, a tall, multi-arched brick causeway that ran toward Vatican City. Fatima guided me through the thick mass of undergrowth, and I thought I could discern the faintest of paths as we pushed on. Suddenly, we came to a clearing beneath the viaduct, a stretch of stone under one of the arches. It looked like a storm drain and followed the line of the viaduct above us. Fatima turned into it, heading toward the brick column that formed one side of the arch we were standing in. When we got closer, I realized it was a freestanding wall, designed to look like part of the arch, and that there was in fact a 1-foot gap between the wall and the viaduct structure. As we edged into the gap, I saw granite steps leading into the ground, beyond the line of the viaduct, past the foundations. When we reached the bottom of the steps, we found an ancient cobblestone well capped with a manhole cover. We were about 16 feet below ground level, and the area around the well was cool, damp, and shaded. Moss grew on the walls, and the stone beneath our feet was wet. Fatima knelt down and brushed away some drifts of leaves to reveal cobblestones interspersed between the big flagstones. She counted 3 stones across and 1 up, then applied pressure to it. The stone gave under her touch. As it dropped, the manhole cover rose, and I realized it was on a runner. I pulled it round, revealing a spiral staircase. Fatima went down it and found a light switch. I followed, closing the manhole cover as she brought a row of lights to life. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I peered along a narrow gray stone tunnel that felt as old as the city itself. "How did you know about this?" I asked.
"I've been smuggled into the Vatican in the past," she replied. "When the Church wanted a favorable view of the restitution it made to victims of abuse. I didn't give them the puff piece they were looking for, but the route they used to smuggle me in is something I've never forgotten."
I shrank inside a little at this mention of one of the great crimes of history, and one of the reasons my faith had waned.
"They did not want to be seen consorting with someone who had been so outspoken in criticizing the Church, which was why they brought me this way."
"Why didn't you write what they wanted?" I asked as we moved along the tunnel. Fatima's nose crinkled as she thought about this.
"The Vatican is where the temporal is supposed to touch the divine. The Holy Father is God's appointed representative on earth, but he is still bound to the same soil as the rest of us. All clergy are, and if we are fallible, so are they. Crimes are to be expected in any human population," she said. "Where the Church went wrong was in failing to honor the victims and give them the justice that is at the heart of Christianity. Instead, some members of the clergy at the highest level tried to cover up the abuse and sweep the victims under the rug."
I nodded. Humans are fallible, and some are evil, but the Church is meant to embody all that is best in us and protect those too weak to protect themselves. In that respect, it had been a major disappointment to me. We walked along the tunnel and climbed 3 flights of steps that tracked the slope of the hill beneath Vatican City. The stairs were steep and long, the ceiling low, so that we almost felt the weight of the city pressing down on us. Finally, we reached a dogleg in the tunnel, which was now blocked by an ancient metal grille.
"This brings us out near the Gallery of the Candelabra, not far from the bank,"
Fatima said, running her fingers along the wall until she found a particular stone, which she pressed to unlock the barrier. She swung it open, and we stepped out into a narrow alleyway between 2 red brick walls. I followed her along this until we reached the end and emerged from the narrow alleyway to see the Gallery of the Candelabra, a long gray building famed for the paintings it housed. We saw a couple of priests walking together, chatting, and when they had moved out of sight, we took the deserted lane that would lead us to the headquarters of the Vatican Bank. We passed under an archway that led us into one of the Vatican's car parks and joined Via Sant'Anna near the bank. We walked around the semicircular building and found a stairwell in the adjacent block leading to a basement. Here we stood a few steps down so we could watch the bank entrance without being seen ourselves. We waited there for an hour, hardly talking, to minimize the risk of giving away our location. The Swiss Guard and Vatican police each conducted one routine sweep of the courtyard ahead of us and the streets nearby, but we ducked into the stairwell on both occasions and remained undisturbed in our hiding place until 8:15 a.m., when Christian Altmer walked through the courtyard in front of us on his way to the bank. I left our hiding place immediately and headed straight for him. He turned when I was almost within touching distance, face contorting in shock as he registered me and then Fatima, a few paces behind.
"What are you doing here?"
he asked.
"Are you crazy?"
"I want the truth," I said. "I know you're working with the Dark Fates. Are you a member of Propaganda Tre?"
"I can't talk about these things. Not here,"
Altmer protested.
"You have to leave."
"Not until you tell us the truth," I responded. "Hey," a man yelled, and I turned to see the Vatican police officers who'd swept the courtyard approaching from Via Sant'Anna.
"You have to go. For your own safety," Altmer said, as the men started running towards us. I'll meet you at the Basilica di San Giovanni in Laterano tonight at 10. Now go.
I hesitated.
Run! Listen to him, Jack,
Fatima implored.
Go. I'll try and slow them down. Just go.
I took her advice and started running. Chapter 75. I sprinted south across the courtyard, away from the police officers, and through a small parking lot toward a high wall and the San Pellegrino gate, which opened onto the North Colonnade and St. Peter's Square. When I glanced over my shoulder, I saw Fatima intercepting the two Vatican police officers, hands raised, arms outstretched, yelling in Italian. Christian Altmer retreated inside the Vatican Bank headquarters. The border officers at the San Pellegrino gate noticed me, and their colleagues pushed past Fatima and yelled at them in Italian. The gate officers started moving toward me as their colleagues resumed pursuit, so I veered east toward the wall. I jumped onto the hood of a delivery wagon, stepped onto its roof, and leapt up to grab the lip of the high wall that marked the perimeter of St. Peter's Square. I ran along the top, ignoring the shouts of my pursuers, and clambered onto a battlement before jumping down into a concrete yard on the other side. My path was blocked by high walls that ran around three sides of the 20 by 60-foot paved yard. The fourth side was occupied by a building. It looked like some kind of residence. I saw what had to be the back entrance a few yards away from me. I ran over to it and peered through the partly glazed door to see a corridor that connected the rear entrance to the front of the house. On the other side of the far door was Via Sant'Anna. I tried the black iron handle and was surprised when it gave under my touch. Inside, 4 interior doors led off the central corridor. A well-equipped kitchen, dining room with 12 tables, sitting room with lots of couches, and a library well-stocked with books. To my left, the staircase wall was lined with photographs of former pontiffs. I was almost at the front door when I glanced over my shoulder and saw 3 Vatican police officers sprint into view in the yard. Their leader was a 40-something man with gray hair and hungry eyes. He caught sight of me through the door. He yelled a command. I swerved left and sprinted upstairs as the cops ran into the corridor behind me. More shouts, which I ignored. By the time I reached the next floor up, the sound of my thundering steps and the cries of the officers behind me had drawn priests to doorways set close together either side of a long corridor. 2 lines of faces surveyed me fearfully. I rounded the landing and bounded up the next flight of stairs, lungs burning, legs aching, and was soon on the next floor, which had fewer doors. I could hear the cries and shouts of the Vatican police behind me and the hammering of their shoes against the wooden stairs. There was another flight, and I started toward it, but stopped in my tracks when a door opened ahead of me. Father Vito appeared in the doorway. Once he got over the shock of seeing me, breathless and harried, he beckoned me over.
"Come, my son," he said. "I will give you sanctuary."
Chapter 76. I ran toward the kindly priest. He stepped aside to allow me to pass before closing the door. He had simple but comfortable lodgings, a small living room overlooking the courtyard, a bedroom off to the right with its own bathroom, and a kitchen of sorts tucked behind a 3-fold floral screen in one corner of the living room.
"Please sit,"
he said, indicating an armchair away from the window. It faced a couch across a low table covered in old newspapers. There was a stovetop coffee maker steaming on a burner in the kitchen area.
"I've just made coffee if you would like some,"
Father Vito remarked. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My heart was racing. I was trying to catch my breath, and my attention was focused on the sound of Vatican police officers hammering on doors further down the corridor.
"Fate will decide what happens to you,"
Father Vito said. He wore black trousers and a white T-shirt, which robbed him of some of his gravitas. It was fascinating to see the difference the black robe made. He seemed less divine, more human somehow. "Fate or God?" I asked.
"I used the word I knew you'd be more comfortable with,"
he replied with a smile.
You look as though you already have enough on your mind without having to wrestle with questions of faith.
There was a loud knock on the door, and whoever was on the other side tried the handle. Thankfully, Father Vito had locked it.
"Quick,"
he whispered.
"Into the bedroom."
I nodded and hurried into the next room, shutting the door behind me. I took a moment to settle, pressed my ear against a panel, and heard Father Vito working the locks. There was a creak as the sitting room door swung open, followed by a voluble exchange of words. Father Vito sounded calm and considered. Whoever he was talking to, angry and imperious. I held my breath and listened to the movements on the other side of the door. I looked around the room for somewhere to hide, but it was little more than a cell with a small window, a low single bed, and a wooden closet. There was a bathroom about half the size of the bedroom, and I edged into it now. I steeled myself for inevitable discovery. With no means of escape, I'd have to fight my way out, and these cops would be well equipped, possibly armed. I hated making enemies of the cops, but I couldn't risk being taken into custody. I heard movement beyond the bedroom door, and then the handle turned. I readied myself to charge at whoever came through. I took a step before registering it was Father Vito, and that he was alone.
"Would you like that coffee now?"
he asked, and I smiled at him and nodded.
"How did you get rid of them?"
I asked, following him out.
"I told them about the sanctity of my chamber, and said I would complain to their superiors if they doubted my word that I hadn't seen you," he said, pouring me a cup of coffee from the aluminum stovetop pot.
"You lied?" I asked.
"A small transgression to prevent a greater one,"
he replied, handing me my coffee. It was just the right temperature. I took a sip before sinking into an armchair. He sat on the couch opposite. "This is good," I said, over my cup.
"Thank the coffee growers of Colombia."
"Why would you lie for me?" I asked, changing the subject.
"Because you're a good man. I see it in you,"
he replied.
"I've also read about you on the internet. We are not totally backward here."
"If honesty doesn't have to be absolute, how do you know when you can lie?" I asked.
"Sometimes it is hard to tell. Sometimes it is easy. Today was easy."
"It seems so much of faith is subject to human interpretation," I remarked. "It can be used for good or evil, depending on who wields it."
"Like a gun,"
Father Vito countered.
"But unlike a gun, there is a book that gives us the key principles. Follow it and life becomes easier to decipher, because that's what we're all trying to do here. Read the signs that allow us to find our way."
"And the Bible is our map?" I suggested. He nodded.
"Exactly. It is a guide. The closer you stay to it, the better your life will be, here and in the hereafter. But of course you can stray. The good stray only when necessary, the bad whenever they feel like it."
"And if you follow its tenets without being a believer?" I asked.
"That's okay too,"
he replied.
"Substance is much better than form. Whatever path you find to God, the important thing is that you take it."
I heard commotion in the yard outside and rose to see the Vatican police leaving. I drained my cup. "Thank you for helping me," I said, "and for the coffee."
"You're welcome,"
Father Vito replied.
"I hope you find peace, Mr. Morgan."
"So do I said, before I moved to the door. "So do I."
"Mr. Morgan, there is a side exit through the kitchen,"
Father Vito told me.
"You might find it useful for a quiet departure."
"Thank you again," I said, before I opened the door to the deserted corridor and stepped out. Chapter 77. I moved swiftly through the old building. I went to the front door and checked Via Sant'Anna, where I saw a squad of Vatican police officers. I moved down the hallway to the kitchen, where I found the side entrance Father Vito had told me about. A covered walkway led between the bank and the papal residence. I followed this to an arch that brought me out at the car park a short distance from the Gallery of the Candelabra. When I was halfway across the car park, I saw 2 men in suits heading in my direction. I was ready to retaliate if they attempted to stop me, but they paid no attention to me. I went to the narrow alleyway beside the gallery and found the metal grill over the entrance to the secret tunnel. I sensed movement nearby and tensed, ready for a fight. Fatima stepped out of an alcove further along the alley, and I grinned with relief.
"You made it then?"
she asked. "I made it," I replied. "You weren't arrested?"
"I just told them I was your hostage,"
she replied.
"That you'd grabbed me in the street and forced me to go with you. By shouting and pretending to panic, I managed to slow them down a little."
"Thank you," I said.
"And you?"
she asked as we headed toward the grill. "There's a priest," I said. "He's been a friend to me a couple times now. He hid me from the cops."
"Wow,"
she replied.
"Someone is looking out for you. It's useful to have those kinds of friends."
"I think he believes he can bring me back to the faith," I said.
"Oh, ulterior motive,"
Fatima remarked, reaching toward the grill. She put her hand through a 4-inch square that had been cut into the metal and felt around for the catch. A moment later, it clicked open and she pushed the grill wide open.
"If this priest is bringing us good luck,"
Fatima said,
"then long may it continue, whatever his motives."
I smiled and followed her into the tunnel. I closed the grill behind us and we set off at a jog, heading back the way we'd come, returning to the secular side of Rome.
Chapter 78. Justine had spent far too long in the cell. She tried to keep track of time, but night had fallen, and eventually she drifted off to sleep, lying on an uncomfortable molded fiberglass bunk. She had woken early to the sounds of other people being moved in and out of custody. Could she hear Mobot or Cy being marched around police headquarters? She had no way of knowing if they were even in the same building. They'd been separated since their arrest at the mall and taken away in different vehicles. Justine had no idea on what charge or charges she was being held. Everything had happened so quickly, and the translator had done a perfunctory job. She had been taken to the holding cells and locked behind a steel door with nothing but a grubby fiberglass toilet and basin to keep her company. There had been a packaged sandwich for dinner, and after dawn a shrink-wrapped pastry that tasted mealy and months old. Despite her own ordeal, Justine was most worried about Jack, and had spent hours worrying about whether he'd got away. After the morning hubbub had died down, and the block had settled into a calmer rhythm, Justine heard footsteps outside her cell. There was an electronic buzz, and the door clicked open. A uniformed officer pulled it wide, and a woman dressed in a navy blue trouser suit stepped inside. "Miss Smith, my name is Inspector Mia Esposito. I'm leading the investigation into the deaths of Father Arturo Brambilla and Inspector Bernardo Baggio." "You'll forgive me if I don't get up," Justine said from her bunk. "It's been a rough night." "I'm also leading the hunt for Jack Morgan." Justine stiffened at the inspector's words, fearing the worst. "You don't happen to know where he is?" Justine's heart soared. So they didn't have him. "I don't," she replied. "I didn't even know he was going to be at the mall. He must have followed us there." Esposito eyed her coolly. "That's what your attorney says," she admitted at last. "Which is why we can't hold you any longer." Justine's mood brightened, but she didn't show it. "Pretty lousy move, trying to pump someone for information when they wrongly think they're still under arrest," she said, getting to her feet. Esposito shrugged. "We all have to play the game to win." "This isn't a game," Justine countered, squaring up to the investigator. They eyed each other for a moment before Esposito stood aside and allowed her to pass. 20 minutes later, she'd been reunited with her possessions and signed out of custody. She left the booking room and entered the busy lobby at police headquarters, where she found Mobot, Cy, and a woman in a smart gray skirt and white blouse waiting for her. Mobot and Cy clustered round like a couple of surrogate parents. "Are you okay, honey?" Mobot asked. "Can you believe how they treated us?" Sai remarked. Miss Smith, my name is Gianna Bianchi. I represent private's interests in Roma. Mr. Morgan asked me to do what I could to secure your release. Gianna Bianchi looked intelligent and resolved, the type of dogged lawyer who'd never give up. Thank you, Justine said, shaking her hand. I had some help, Gianna revealed. Your embassy protested about your treatment, which created the right kind of pressure. Justine guessed she and Mobot had made a good impression on Emily Carter. Any word on Jack? Mobot and Sai shook their heads. I've made arrangements for your new accommodation, Gianna said. There was a police operation at your former residence last night. Mobot leant in closer. Intruder alarms were tripped, but I only saw the alerts on my phone when I was released about 30 minutes ago. She whispered, someone was in the apartment. Someone who wasn't Jack. I checked with my police contacts at Miss Roth's suggestion, Gianna said, and there was an explosion and 2 arrests made there yesterday. Justine's heart sank. It's not Mr. Morgan, Gianna went on. Apparently it was a couple of gang members found outside the building. Dark fates? Justine asked. Mobot nodded, but no news on Jack, so we have to assume he's okay. Secure messenger? Justine asked. I haven't checked yet. Good chance we've picked up some additional company while we were inside. Friends listening to our calls, keyloggers checking passwords, spyware monitoring our browsing and location, Mobot revealed. It hadn't even occurred to Justine their phones might be bugged by the police. We're going to need to make a stop on our way to the new place, Mobot said before turning to Gianna. We're ready whenever you are. I've had enough of this dive. Chapter 79. Gianna Bianchi's late-model Audi Q7 seemed an impractical car for Rome, but Justine was glad not to be in one of the many tiny Fiats that whizzed fearlessly around the city. She looked out of the window at the sun-kissed buildings and pedestrians walking in the heat, the packed pavement cafes and air-conditioned stores, and wondered where Jack was and what had happened to him after their arrest. Mobot had made a call as they'd walked to the lawyer's car and had spoken to whoever replied in code. After the call, she told Gianna to head for the Fontana di Venere, near the Gianicolo, one of the tallest hills in Rome. Gianna knew exactly where it was, though it took them 30 minutes of fighting through heavy traffic to reach the lush green park with its grand fountain and formal gardens. Can you wait here? Mobot asked her when she pulled into a space in the nearest parking lot. My contact is a little skittish. The lawyer nodded. It's better if I stay away, particularly if there is any illegality involved. Oh, we won't be doing anything illegal, Mobot assured her. The opposite, in fact, if my hunch is right. Justine was intrigued, but she knew better than to quiz Mobot, who was obviously concealing something from the lawyer. Bring everything the cops took from you, Mobot told her associates. They followed her through the parking lot and along a tree-lined path beside a walled garden. They tracked the wall to its end and went through a doorway into a less cultivated area. Justine noticed a woman sitting on a bench set back from the path. She beamed as Mobot approached and rose to make a beeline for them. The woman had short brown hair, piercings in her ears, nose, and eyebrows, and tattoos covering her arms and legs, where they were exposed by a black t-shirt and pair of matching shorts. Justine, Sai, this is Valentina, Mobot said before embracing the younger woman. She's a formidable digital warrior. A hacker? Sai asked. Valentina rolled her eyes. Don't mind him, Mobot told her. He's a dinosaur. Are you the one who helped Jack? Justine asked. Valentina nodded, but before she could say anything, Mobot cut in. Why don't we check out the gear? Did you bring the kit? Yes. It's over here, Valentina said, walking to the bench by the walled garden. Justine, Sai, and Mobot followed, and joined Valentina as she was opening a Peli flight case that contained a trove of electronic equipment. Justine recognized some of the gear as counter-surveillance devices. Give me everything the cops took from you, Mobot said. Justine and Sai complied, handing over a wallet, purse, phones, passports, and belts. Mobot ran a scanner over everything and found 2 tracking devices, one embedded in Sai's phone and the other sewn into Justine's purse. After scanning each item with a wand that detected electronic signals, Mobot passed the item to Valentina, who examined it further. She connected Sai's and Justine's phones to a tiny computer and analyzed the installed apps. Software tracker, using the phone's GPS to send its location to a remote server, Valentina revealed. It's on both devices. And there's a keylogger sending the same server everything typed on these devices. All your messages can be read remotely. They hacked us, Sai remarked. I do wish you'd stop using that word, Mobot replied. But yes, they hacked us. That's probably why they held us for so long, so they could install all this junk. What about my phone? She asked, handing over her device. Valentina connected it to the computer and examined the file directory. She nodded. Same. Can you clean them? Mobot asked. Sure, Valentina replied. No problem. No listening devices. Valentina shook her head. Location and text only. Good, Mobot said. Then we can speak freely. She turned to Justine. You wanted to ask about Jack? Yes. Have you heard from him? Of course, Valentina said. I found another safe place for him and his friend. I'll take you as soon as we're finished here.
Chapter 80. Fatima and I rode buses to return to the warehouse by the river. I wanted to be able to see if anyone was following us. Hopping on and off the crowded vehicles provided us with plenty of cover, hiding among the tourists in central Rome, and then commuters as we moved toward the suburbs.
Are you going to meet Altmer tonight?
Fatima asked as we stepped off the number 5 bus at a remote stop a short distance from the warehouse. I could smell salt in the air, blowing in on a west wind. What choice do I have? I asked. We went to the Vatican this morning in search of answers. We didn't find any, so I have to try again. I don't understand why he was concerned for our safety.
Maybe it was a ruse to give himself enough time to set a trap,
Fatima remarked, as we walked along the lane leading to the riverside warehouses.
To destroy evidence or warn collaborators?
Well, we know he's involved somehow, and the dark fates obviously play a role, and that there is a powerful conspiracy at work. Let's try and put the pieces together from what we have, I suggested. We should review everything again, go back to the beginning. Fatima nodded, and we hurried into the warehouse. We went up to the apartment, and I made us some strong coffee, using the supplies she had purchased earlier that morning. Armed with the black jet fuel, we sat at Mobot's computer and reviewed the copious amounts of evidence we'd amassed. The surveillance footage of the Inferno bar and the background files on Altmer and Milan Verde. We worked for over an hour without success until Fatima accessed her files on La Repubblica's cloud server. She reviewed the dossier she'd amassed on the mysterious deaths Filippo Lombardi had begun investigating. She'd started a file on Father Brambilla and was swiping through some archive photos the newspaper had of him at Vatican functions. Wait, I said. Go back. I'd seen a face I recognized at a fundraiser being held at the Vatican for the Orphans of Rome, a city charity. Fatima scrolled back, and there in the image, standing next to Christian Altmer and Father Brambilla, was Father Vito. But he wasn't wearing the priest's cassock I was familiar with. He wore the deep purple of a cardinal. That's Father Vito, I said, the priest who helped me. Fatima shook her head.
That's Cardinal Vito Peralta, one of the most powerful princes of the Church.
I thought back to our first meeting at the Garden of Secret Confession. What had he been doing there? Could he have been involved in what had happened? Had I been taken in by his simple piety? Why is he posing as a priest? I asked.
He's known as an ascetic. He believes in the purity of simplicity and thinks the ceremonial trappings and ceremony of the Church are a distraction from true worship,
Fatima replied.
He is a divisive figure, for that and other reasons.
Such as?
He is one of the directors of the Vatican Bank. He believes the Church should be more interventionist in the way it uses its assets, that it should tie investments to religious aims and political objectives.
I realized I'd misjudged the man, taking him for a junior priest because of his plain clothes and approachable manner.
His supporters whisper his name whenever there is talk of who will become the next pope,
Fatima revealed. As I studied the photo of the man who had twice offered help and advice, I wondered if concern for my soul had motivated him to take an interest in me, or whether all along he had sought to manipulate and misdirect. Chapter 81. I started to replay my encounters with Father Vito, but didn't get far on my trawl, because there was the loud and unmistakable sound of someone hitting the warehouse shutters. Fatima and I were on our feet instantly and left the apartment. We crept downstairs into the disused and empty offices, and I moved ahead into the warehouse itself, picked my way around the stacks of boxes, and climbed a loading platform that gave me access to the high letterbox windows overlooking the main entrance. My thundering heartbeat eased, and the tension melted away when I saw Justine, Sai, and Mobot standing outside with Valentina. "Let them in," I said to Fatima, and she hurried over to the small roll shutter, unlocked it, and opened it. My colleagues stepped inside, their relief to see me palpable. Valentina followed them and closed the shutter behind her. I jumped off the loading platform and went over to Justine, who threw her arms around me. We kissed, and I didn't care that we had company. I was just so relieved to see her and hold her in my arms again. I was reluctant to let go.
"Okay, that's enough," Mobot said. "We'll cut you lovebirds some slack, but this is a professional outfit, and we got work to do."
Justine and I parted, and I saw Fatima and Valentina grinning at Mobot's intervention. "It's so good to see you," I told Justine, before turning to Mobot and Sai. "All of you. Let's go upstairs." I took them into the apartment above the offices. Mobot squeaked with delight when she saw her laptop.
"I thought I'd lost my baby,"
she said, as though speaking to a cherished pet. "You nearly did. A member of Propaganda Tre was in the apartment downloading the hard drives. He had a program set up to wipe them, but I managed to stop him."
"I owe you, Jack,"
Mobot said, sitting at her machine. Sai crouched to check the contents of the hold-all I'd managed to retrieve. "You got our gear," he said. "Well, most of it anyway. Good work, boss." He had a way of saying boss that made it sound as though he was praising a junior.
"We've lost all the feeds,"
Mobot said, retrieving the surveillance footage that showed Milan Verde and the other members of the Dark Fates destroying the concealed cameras.
"They must have swept the place to discover them all, which makes them more sophisticated than your average street gang."
"We have enough gear left to get eyes and ears on them again," Sai responded, gesturing at the hold-all. "I want to know what they're hiding." "A meeting with Christian Altmer for one thing," I revealed. "It's on the surveillance footage about 4 hours before they destroyed the cameras. We'd never have known if they'd succeeded in wiping the machines."
"Altmer again,"
Justine remarked. "Looks like you were right about him," I replied. "I'm meeting him later."
"And walking into a trap,"
Fatima said unhelpfully. Justine flashed me a look of concern.
"When?
Why?" she asked. "To find out what he knows. Why he's consorting with a street gang," I said. "I want you, Sai, and Mobot to re-establish surveillance on the Inferno. We need to know what else the Dark Fates are hiding." I wanted us to have eyes and ears on the gang, but a large part of the reason I asked Justine to go to the bar in Esquilino was to keep her away from my meeting with Altmer. I knew I would be walking into danger, and didn't want our personal relationship to complicate a potentially volatile situation.
"No way,"
she said.
"I'm coming with you. I can help you with Altmer, read the situation, watch for danger, have your back."
"And I can get you out of danger,"
Mobot said. Sai can't handle the Inferno on his own, I responded.
Not after last time, he conceded. They'll have guessed I was the one who planted the devices, and if their man reviewed the footage, he'll have seen me walking away from them after I put them in position.
I'll go, Jack,
Fatima said.
I'll help Sai. Then the others can go with you, keep you safe.
I couldn't think of any reason to object.
Thank you, Miss Salah.
Mobot said.
It's nice to meet someone else who's brimming with common sense.
I'd like to help too,
Valentina said, speaking up at last. She seemed a little starstruck and looked at Mobot with unmistakable awe.
It would be an honor to work with you in the real world.
Don't overdo it, Valentina,
Mobot said.
I might develop a god complex or something. If it's okay with the boss, I think we'll take all the help we can get.
I nodded. Mobot was right. We were facing a network of powerful interests and weren't in any position to turn away offers of assistance from people with special talents. It's fine with me, I said, and Valentina smiled.
Chapter 82. Valentina gave Sai and Fatima her car, a 2-year-old black Maserati Levante. Fatima drove it through the busy streets of Rome, more crowded than usual thanks to Roma's match against Inter Milan, which was due to start at 7 p.m. It took them over 2 hours to get from Ostia to Esquilino. "Do you do this much?" Fatima asked. Sai shook his head. "Normally, I get to hang out with dead bodies and crime scenes. Forensic investigation is my specialism. But when Jack gets himself in a jam, we all have to improvise. You?" "More than I would like," Fatima replied, steering the car around a crowd of Inter fans, who were chanting boisterously as they crossed the road. "It's getting harder and harder to hold the rich and powerful to account. Often it requires exceptional measures." "Exceptional measures," Sai responded. "I like that." "Does Jack get into many of these jams?" Sai sighed. "Too many to count. Trouble follows him like a loyal dog, and he's got too much decency and honor to shoo it away." "Yes," Fatima replied. "He seems like a good man." "He is," Sai said, and they drove on in silence for a while. The streets shed any semblance of wealth, comfort, and much of their beauty as they entered Esquilino. "Next right," Sai said as they approached Via Mamiani. Fatima nodded and took the turn. She saw the brightly lit symbol of a flame and the similarly illuminated word Inferno over the entrance to the bar. She pulled into a space about 50 yards from the corner. Most of the stores around them were closed, either permanently or for the match, their drawn shutters daubed with graffiti. Further along the street, a takeaway, cafe, and another bar were open, but none had many customers. The Inferno bar was the liveliest place on Via Mamiani, blasting music into the early evening air. There were a few smokers gathered outside who looked to Fatima angry and degenerate, the kind of ignorant men and women who had given her such a hostile reception when she'd first arrived in Italy. "What now?" she asked Sai, but he was already rooting around in the holdall on the back seat. After a moment, he turned back to face her with a tiny device and a remote control in his hand. The device looked like a wasp and was about the same size. "Micro-drone," he said. "It will give us eyes and ears very quickly." He switched on both devices and wound his window down to allow the miniature drone to fly out. Fatima watched him use the screen on the remote control to pilot the small aircraft, which broadcast a live feed from a camera attached to its nose. "This would be really useful," Fatima said. "How can I get one?" "Military grade," Sai remarked before cracking a smile. "Just kidding. We have a supplier who specializes in building them for law enforcement and intelligence agencies around the world. I'm sure I can talk Jack into loaning you a couple if we have any left at the end of this." He turned his full attention to the screen as the drone approached the bar. He tried the windows first, but they were all closed. "Let's see about the air conditioning," he said, piloting the drone toward an AC intake. The vents had been covered with a micro mesh, and the resin fixing it looked fresh. "This wasn't here before," Sai remarked. The same mesh covered every pipe and inlet leading into the building. Then it's going to have to be the front door, Sai said, steering the drone around the group of smokers. The front door swung wide, and another member of the Dark Fates stepped out to join the smokers, which gave Sai the opportunity to pilot the drone inside the bar. Suddenly, the image became a jumble of shapes, and the remote control turned unresponsive. Moments later, the screen cut to sudden static. "Jeez," he said, reviewing the last few seconds of footage. "They've put an air curtain above the door. Someone has helped them bolster their physical security." "What do we do?" Fatima asked, but she already knew the answer. "One of us needs to go inside, right? And it can't be you." Chapter 83. "If they recognize you," Sai began, but Fatima cut him off. "I'll run. I just need to get one of those drones inside, don't I?" Sai nodded. "I can put it in Milan Verdi's office. Provided it doesn't fly too much, we'll get 2 days out of the batteries." "Then it's worth doing," Fatima said, taking a deep breath. The Dark Fates were dangerous, but she had faced danger before. She'd crossed the Mediterranean in a tiny boat, seeing people in her flotilla die. She'd been up close to catastrophic loss, and it had forever changed her perspective on life, making her simultaneously more appreciative and less cautious. She cherished life, but she also knew there were times one had to risk sacrifice because it was the right thing to do. Sai handed her another drone from the holdall and checked it was connected to the remote. He nodded. "You're good to go." Fatima smiled wanly and stepped out of the car. The warm afternoon air combined with her nervousness to make her feel a little queasy, but she fought the rising nausea and forced her feet to move one step at a time toward the Inferno bar. She could hear the sound of the television build-up to the Roma-Inter Milan football match coming through the windows of nearby apartments. As she got closer to the bar, the sound of football was lost beneath thunderous music. She saw far-right insignia among the tattoos on the arms of some of the smokers on the pavement. She'd met many racists in her life, but was conscious of her increased personal risk in this situation. She didn't need to be recognized as a journalist. One of these angry men or women just had to take a dislike to the color of her skin. She heard them talking, discussing some show on Netflix. They fell silent as she drew near, and she was suddenly very aware of her smart white linen trousers and red blouse, which were at odds with the biker/rock band roadie vibe of the place. She couldn't have stood out more if she'd tried. "This is a private bar," the man closest to her said, drawing on a cigarette. "Foreigners aren't welcome." The men and women around him chuckled. "I don't see a sign," Fatima replied in Italian. "And I'm not a foreigner." "Well, you don't look Italian." "You don't look intelligent. But we shouldn't judge others on their appearance," Fatima responded, finding the reserves of courage that had never yet failed her. The reply played well with the man's companions and drew a louder chuckle, but on finding himself the butt of the joke, the smoker scowled and lumbered closer to her. He sported a gray t-shirt bearing the image of a screaming white skull and wore his loose jeans hitched low. "It's a private bar," he said, reaching out and putting an intimidating ham-sized hand on her shoulder. She looked at his fat, scarred fingers as they squeezed. "That's assault," Fatima said calmly. She produced a stun gun from her purse, drove it into the man's ribs, and pulled the trigger. He fell to the ground, convulsing, and she stepped clear and addressed his companions. "I just want to drink and to use the ladies' room." Their chuckles and smiles had vanished. A couple of them hurried over to help their fallen companion, but no one did anything to stop Fatima entering the bar. She felt the powerful air blanket on the top of her head and walked on, sensing the stir her arrival had caused. As she moved toward the counter, conversation stopped, and soon the only sound was the angry screeching of death metal blaring through the bar's sound system. A muted television hanging on the wall showed the kickoff of the Roma-Inter match. "I'd like a beer," Fatima said to the unfriendly barman, "and the ladies' room." He stared at her for a moment before nodding toward a corridor to her right. She put 20 euros on the counter and walked in the direction he'd indicated. When she reached the corridor, she slipped her hand into her purse and took out the drone, which flew away silently. She reached for the ladies' room door handle, but it was opened from the inside, and Fatima was confronted by a woman wearing too much eyeliner and mascara and a vintage Led Zeppelin t-shirt. She looked taken aback for a moment.
"Who the hell are you? You're not coming in here. This is a private bathroom, huh? Move!"
The woman pushed Fatima, who this time didn't react. She'd done what she needed to do and allowed herself to be marched through the bar by the angry, over-made-up rocker. A man held the door open, gave a mocking bow, and the whole bar erupted in cheers as Fatima was thrown out. Even though she'd acquiesced in this treatment, she walked away full of anger and thoughts of vengeance against such narrow-minded, hateful people. She could hear their raucous laughter and chatter above the pounding music. She glanced back at the group of smokers who'd now managed to revive the man she'd stunned. Fatima moved more quickly to avoid any attempt at retribution. Adrenaline coursing, heart pounding, she sighed with relief when she rejoined Sai in the Maserati.
"You were brilliant," he said. "So brave."
She almost teared up at his kind words, but swallowed the lump forming in her throat. "And look," he said, gesturing at the screen on the remote control. "This is the view inside Milan Verdi's office." Fatima glanced over and saw Verdi sitting on a couch. In the armchair next to him was a man she recognized. Stefano Trotta, the finance minister she had briefly encountered at Elia Antonelli's farm. "What's he saying?" Sai asked. Fatima listened to Trotta's words. "He's saying they have nearly achieved their goals," she replied, translating, "that their friend and patron is close to reaching his objective." Fatima couldn't help feeling they were talking about Antonelli, and that the seasoned gangster had once again played her and Jack Morgan for fools. She settled in to see what else the drone would reveal about these evil men.
Chapter 84. It was 1 minute after 10 when I arrived at the Basilica di San Giovanni in Laterano, a magnificent place of worship less than a mile from the Colosseum. Situated at the heart of a large piazza, the grand building, described as the mother of all churches, stood more than 4 stories high. Thick marble columns supported a portico adorned with statues of the saints. I walked beyond the metal railings that were used for crowd control during the day and went through an open gate to access the portico. The sign by the main entrance said the church should be long closed, but the door gave under my touch. When I entered, I found the interior was illuminated by lights set into the stone cornicing halfway up the magnificently decorated walls. The floor was as beautiful as any I'd ever seen, an intricate black and white pearlescent tile pattern, and the ceiling was embossed with gold reliefs. Marble statues set in arched niches lined the walls. Beyond the pews, directly in line with the main entrance, stood the high altar. I crossed the grand floor and moved down the central aisle, unable to shake the feeling I was being watched, though I saw nothing untoward as I scanned the ancient church to left and right of me. I made my way to the altar, but there was no sign of Altmer seated in the nearby pews or hidden in the shadows farther away. When I was within a few feet of the first row, I heard a distinctive sound that chilled me. I ran forward to find him lying on his back, blood pooling on the tiled floor around him, the hilt of an old-fashioned steel dagger sticking out of his chest. He was pawing at it weakly, but his eyes shifted and focused on me when I rushed to his side. He gasped and moaned in pain. As I checked his pulse and tried to overcome my shock at finding him this way, I realized he was trying to speak. I'll never forget the choking, gurgling noises he made as he frantically sucked air into lungs that sounded as if they were full of fluid. Finally, he managed to say,
"I tried to do right. Matteo is lying."
His eyes went blank. I tried mouth to mouth, but it was no use. He was gone. I couldn't believe another man had died in front of me, and that with his dying breath, he had warned me not to trust my latest private recruit. I'd managed to convince myself of Matteo's innocence, But could I continue to do so now?
Jack Morgan, we know you're inside. Surrender immediately.
I recognized the voice of Inspector Mia Esposito. She was talking through a bullhorn. I'd been completely set up and had no doubt this death would be pinned on me too. I heard movement around the church, the tramp of boots, the catch and lock of weapons being checked, radios crackling to life with terse commands. There was no way I was fighting my way out of here or escaping unscathed. I got to my feet and walked toward the main entrance with a sense of weary resignation. When I opened the door, I saw Esposito had brought what looked like half of Rome's police officers with her. Many were armed and had their weapons trained on me. They needn't have bothered. I put up no resistance when Esposito climbed the steps and turned me around.
Jack Morgan, you are under arrest,
she said, as she put me in handcuffs. Chapter 85. Roma must have won, because when I was transported from the Basilica to whichever police station I was destined for, the streets were filled with loud and cheerful fans, singing and chanting. Mia Esposito sat up front next to the driver, the plainclothes officer who kept giving me hate-filled looks. He was the kind of cop who took the job personally and had probably swallowed the line that I was responsible for Bernardo Baggio's death. They exchanged words in Italian and laughed at the sight of some of the raucous celebrations. A few of the Roma fans had their shirts off and were running around, clearly very drunk. "I didn't kill them, you know," I said to Esposito. "Christian Altmer, Bernardo Baggio, and Father Carlos Diaz. Someone has set me up."
Then you took a risk coming to the Basilica if you're the victim of a conspiracy, Mr. Morgan,
Esposito replied. "I thought Mr. Altmer was behind whatever got all these people killed, so it seemed worth the risk to come and talk to him," I replied. "Never expected to find him the way I did, but the fact that he's been murdered tells me he was just a bit player in whatever's happening."
And you think you're going to be left alone to sit out the rest of it, do you?
Esposito challenged me.
Not while there's a theory that you've killed anyone who might testify against your colleague, Matteo Ricci. You will remain in custody until you can prove your innocence to the satisfaction of Rome's prosecutors.
"Or I'm conveniently killed in jail," I said, and Esposito and her colleague exchanged looks. "Did you find Bernardo Baggio?" I asked. "We did," the hostile cop said. "And I want to know how come you knew about him." "I don't know anything about the circumstances of his death. All I know is he was on duty the night my colleague is supposed to have tried to take his own life." I leaned forward, my arms locking against the cuffs. "Inspector Esposito, if you can't see you're being played, you're not the cop I thought you were." She considered my words but didn't respond. We were in the thick of the revelry by now, and the traffic was making slow progress through cheering crowds on both sides of Via Marco Aurelio. I could see the Colosseum up ahead, the ancient monument beautifully lit against the night sky. The bars either side of the street were packed with exuberant fans spilling out onto the road. At the intersection with Via Claudia, we had to wait for a herd of Roma supporters to migrate south to north over the zebra crossing. When the street finally cleared, the hostile cop at the wheel inched forward, only to find our path suddenly blocked by a bus full of Roma fans that had stopped at the mouth of the intersection. The driver cursed and hit his horn, starting a cacophony of other car horns from behind us, the sounds merging with the celebratory cheers and shouts to add to the general air of chaos. The driver had no more idea than Inspector Esposito what was about to happen, but I did. And when I saw Amr Badawi sitting near the front of the bus, I steeled myself for what was to come. The bus doors opened, and a crowd of Roma supporters spilt out of the vehicle, led by Amr. Inspector Esposito and her colleague were bemused at first, but their bewilderment quickly turned to panic as 50 fans, some of them armed with crowbars and other tools, encircled our vehicle. Inspector Esposito glanced back at me as one of the men closest to her swung his crowbar. "I'm still in the game," I remarked, the instant before the window shattered. Esposito tried to draw her weapon, but was quickly disarmed by men who prized the front doors open. Both cops were dragged from the vehicle and subdued, and Ammer reached into the front and unlocked the rear doors. Someone I didn't recognize helped me out. Moments later, another man found Esposito's keys and uncuffed me. I was ushered onto the bus with the men who'd helped me escape. The whole thing had taken less than 3 minutes. When I glanced back, I saw Inspector Esposito and her colleague handcuffed to a lamppost, struggling to catch the attention of passing fans, who were so drunk they laughed and jeered at them, obviously thinking they were the victims of some kind of prank. I walked to the front of the bus where I found Mobot, Justine, and Valentina. We were joined by Ammer. "Thanks," I said, grateful and relieved to be reunited with them. "No problem," he replied.
"You inspire loyalty," Mobot remarked. "At a price. These guys are charging for their time."
I glanced at Ammer, who shrugged.
Business is business, Mr. Morgan.
I smiled and sat beside Justine as the bus rumbled north past the stunning ruins of the ancient circus.
"So Altmer is dead?"
she asked. I nodded.
"And whoever killed him tried to frame you,"
she observed. "Yeah," I said.
"If we keep at them, they're going to change tactics and treat you as a more urgent threat."
I nodded again. She was right. If I wasn't already marked for death, it was only a matter of time before a target was put on my back. Chapter 86. The plan with the bus had been Valentina's idea. She knew Ammer and most of his friends were diehard Roma fans, and that sheer force of numbers could overwhelm any police van or escort vehicles. As it was, Inspector Esposito had underestimated the resources at our disposal, so hadn't had an escort of any kind. To avoid any of his friends learning where we were staying, Ammer had the bus drop us off on Via della Ancore, about 20 minutes' walk from the warehouse. He left the vehicle and joined us on the short journey to make sure we got there safely. Justine and I walked side by side, and even though it didn't feel right to hold hands in these circumstances, our fingers kept brushing together. In the end, I didn't care what the others thought. I took her hand, and she smiled at me all the time we were on the dark street. When we arrived at the warehouse, there was a young woman inside who'd set up a table of serving dishes laden with food. She was of Middle Eastern extraction and wore tight jeans and a retro Madonna t-shirt.
"This is my sister, Amina,"
Ammer explained.
"She's brought the food my aunt made for us. There's kolkas, a taro root stew, koshari, which is lentils, macaroni and rice, and kebab hala, a dry beef stew, plus vegetables, baladi bread, and rice. Whatever happens, you will not starve in Rome."
"Thank you, Ammer and Amina," I said, and the others concurred. Amina gave us plates and made sure we helped ourselves to plenty of food before joining us in a makeshift dining area between the crates and boxes that formed Ammer's stock. "Thanks," I said to my colleagues and new friends.
"Anytime,"
Mobot replied. Justine smiled.
"They say you're a wanted man, as are many of your known associates,"
Valentina revealed, looking up from her phone. "Sorry," I offered. The roll shutter rose suddenly, and Sai and Fatima entered. "What's that smell?" he asked. "It's amazing."
"Food over there,"
Mobot replied.
"Courtesy of the Badawi family."
"Help yourself,"
Ammer said. "I will," Sai assured him. I introduced Sai and Fatima, and when they had loaded their plates, they joined us. "How did it go?" he asked. "Altmer is dead. Someone tried to frame me, and they almost succeeded. I got arrested," I replied. "But Valentina hatched a plan, and these guys sprung me." "Standard Morgan night out," Sai replied. "And you?" I asked.
"We were able to get a bug inside,"
Fatima replied. "Only because she's got nerves of steel," Sai interjected. Fatima waved away the praise.
"We saw Milan Verde meeting with Stefano Trotta.
The minister we saw at Elia Antonelli's house? Fatima nodded. So Antonelli might have been lying about having no connections to the Dark Fates, I suggested.
Seems that way, Sai replied.
And we've learned the priest who befriended me isn't what he seems, I said. And before he died, Altmer said something. The whole group waited expectantly. His last words were that Matteo is lying, I revealed, and saw their expressions of shock. Like me, they would be struggling to believe that our colleague, the man who was at the heart of this investigation, might not have been completely honest with us. Chapter 87. After we'd eaten, Amr and Amina had left and Valentina had gone with them. Sai and I bunked in one of the bedrooms, Justine and Mobot had taken another, and Fatima was in the third. By 2 a.m., I'd puzzled through every aspect of this investigation, and the picture still wasn't any clearer. To get to the truth, I needed a breakthrough, and I had an idea how to get it, but it would involve a betrayal. A small one, but a betrayal nonetheless. I waited until I was sure Sai was asleep, his heavy breathing reverberating around the room. I grabbed my clothes and crept out. I moved quietly through the living area until I was near the front door.
"Where are you going?"
Justine whispered. I turned to see her fully dressed, ready to leave. She walked over to me and ran her fingers over my bare chest. Her touch felt good, and I pulled her close for a kiss. Our lips met. For a time, I forgot everything else.
"You're so predictable,"
she said, pulling away.
"The moment you mentioned what Altmer had said, I knew where you'd go. And I knew you'd try and go alone, so as not to endanger the rest of us."
"Wow," I replied. "Am I that transparent?" She had predicted my small betrayal, leaving my team so I could go out alone. She nodded.
"Put your shirt on,"
she said, pushing past me.
"We can't risk waking the others."
"We?" I asked, disappointed to be getting dressed rather than undressed.
"Yes, I'm coming with you,"
she replied, opening the front door. Chapter 88. The cab driver barely glanced back as he drove us into the center of Rome. Justine held my hand. We didn't speak. I didn't want to risk drawing the driver's attention, and besides, there wasn't really anything to say. I was about to do something very dangerous, something that could put my liberty and possibly my life at risk. But I needed to get to the truth and was prepared to take a risk to do it. Whoever was behind this had tried to kill me and harm my colleagues. It had moved beyond proving Matteo's guilt or innocence and was now deeply personal. We crossed the river and arrived at Isola Tiberina and Fatti Bene Fratelli Hospital shortly after 3 a.m. We got out of the cab and Justine paid the driver.
"Are you sure you want to do this?"
she asked. I nodded. We crossed the driveway in front of the old building and went in through the main entrance. The hospital was busy, which wasn't surprising considering how much drinking had been going on in Rome that night. Most of the people crowding the waiting area and corridors that ran off it were young men in Roma kits. A combustible mix of post-match euphoria and too much alcohol had resulted in their hospital visits. The crowds were useful to us, though. We moved through the building unnoticed by the overworked staff, climbing the stairs to the third floor where Matteo's room was located. When we emerged into an empty corridor, I heard voices in indistinct conversation, and from another direction, footsteps.
"Same plan?"
Justine asked. I nodded. While we'd waited for the cab, we'd hatched a plan to distract the cops posted outside Matteo's room, but it would require great acting on her part to pull it off. I did not doubt her ability to deliver. We entered the ward, and I waited by the nurse's station while Justine went around the corner to get rid of the cops. There was no one else in sight, and muted echoes of events taking place elsewhere made the atmosphere even more eerie. Hospitals were daunting and strange enough during the day, but at night they became positively spooky. Justine came round the corner and waved me forward. I frowned. This wasn't part of our plan, but she was insistent. When I joined her, I saw why. There was a solitary cop outside Matteo's room, and he was fast asleep. Pietro, the wiry bodyguard from Primo Security, sat opposite. He nodded at us as we approached. "No partner?" I asked quietly. Pietro shook his head and raised his index finger, indicating a single officer was on duty. I nodded my thanks. Justine and I moved on cautiously. When we reached Matteo's room, I opened the door and we crept inside. He was asleep but stirred as I approached his bed. Justine kept watch through the glazed panel in the door.
"Jack,"
Matteo whispered. His voice sounded a little stronger than it had during our last encounter, but he still looked weak and pale. Dark shadows ringed his eyes.
"I saw the news. I'm sorry."
"What are you sorry for?" I asked. "Lying to me?" He didn't look shocked, just disappointed. I couldn't tell whether it was with me or himself. "Why don't you save us both some time and tell me what you've been hiding?" I said.
"I can't,"
he said.
"for the sake of a soul."
"Whose soul?" I asked. I glanced at Justine and saw she shared my concern. Was this man mentally competent? Had his injuries affected him psychologically? Had he really tried to take his own life?
"Brambilla's,"
Matteo replied. Justine and I shared another glance, both of us perplexed.
"What do you mean, Brambilla's soul?"
she asked.
"The gravest sin,"
Matteo replied, his eyes glistening. "You mean suicide?" I asked. He nodded.
"You think Father Brambilla took his own life?"
Justine asked.
"When he came to the party, agitated and wanting to talk,"
Matteo replied.
"I took him somewhere we could speak in private. After we went into the room, he knocked me unconscious. When I came to, he was dead. I must have picked up the gun instinctively when I came round and found him dead."
"And you didn't tell us because you thought you could save his soul with a lie?" I asked.
"Who would pray for such a man?"
Matteo asked.
"He would not receive a Christian burial."
This adherence to dogma was part of the reason I'd lost my faith. A soul in such torment was surely more worthy of absolution than a murderer, and yet someone who had knowingly taken another person's life could confess and seek forgiveness, while someone who took their own could not. Dogma warped the faithful's perspective to such an extent that someone devout and faithful, like Matteo, trained in a seminary, believed he was protecting Brambilla's eternal soul by concealing his suicide. Faith had twisted reason. Here was Matteo trying to save the soul of someone who had caused him nothing but trouble, because he believed that telling a lie could prevent the man's eternal damnation. "How do you know it was Brambilla who knocked you out?" I asked. Matteo looked puzzled.
"Who else could it have been? We were the only ones in the room."
I glanced at Justine, who clearly shared my frustration. "You should have told us," I said.
"I'm sorry, Jack,"
Matteo responded, tears falling from his eyes.
"I was trying to do the right thing for my friend. He does not deserve purgatory."
"No one does," I told him. "Especially not a good priest like Father Brambilla." Chapter 89. Justine and I left the hospital and crossed the Ponte Fabrizio, a cobbled, pedestrianized bridge north of the hospital. There was no one else around, and for a moment I wanted to forget the danger we faced, the secrets we'd uncovered, and instead pretend we were regular people with normal lives. That we were out for a starlit stroll in this ancient and romantic setting, and that all the wonder of Rome had been created just for us. I stopped and pulled Justine toward me. She wrapped her arms around my neck and kissed me, until I became aware of movement to my right. 2 men, hospital security guards on patrol, were heading our way.
"No rest for the wicked,"
Justine remarked as we resumed our journey. Or the virtuous, I replied with a smile. We caught a taxi on Lungotevere de Cenci, the broad, leafy avenue that tracked the sinuous line of the Tiber. The driver barely gave us a second glance as we got in the back, but when we said we wanted to go to Ostia, he grumbled and told us he wouldn't get a good fare on the return journey. I offered him double. That didn't quite make him smile, but it did silence his complaints. Justine and I stayed silent, partly because I didn't want the man overhearing details of our investigation, but largely because I was still reeling from Matteo's revelation. Faith had prevented him from telling the truth. It had made him irrational. Did he really believe that by ensuring his friend and mentor received a Christian burial, he could sneak Brambilla into heaven? Surely it was the contents of a person's heart, not their actions, that defined their relationship with God. Or maybe that was just a comforting fiction, I told myself.
"You okay?"
Justine asked.
"You seem distracted."
The cab was racing through deserted streets, chewing up the distance as we shot past stores and restaurants that were silent and shuttered. "I'm fine," I replied. "Just thinking about Matteo and wondering whether I've made a big mistake. I hired him because he seemed honest, but he made a huge error of judgment and concealed the truth." Justine took my hand and squeezed it gently.
"He was trying to do the right thing by his friend. It might have been misguided, but his heart was in the right place."
I nodded. Truth and justice were my guides, and sometimes I struggled to understand how other people prioritize different values.
"Do you think Brambilla took his own life?"
she asked. "He was agitated," I replied. "He badly wanted to share a secret. I don't believe he would have killed himself before doing so."
"Which leaves Matteo or someone else?"
Justine suggested.
"And if it was someone else, it was someone at the party."
I nodded again. Someone who got in and out of the room without being seen and was able to overpower Matteo and silence Brambilla. Sounds like a ghost, doesn't it? Justine frowned.
"No, someone far more dangerous. You said you saw Luna Colombo that night, running away from the scene."
She let the suggestion hang. We both looked at the driver, who was nodding along to low music coming from the radio. "No," I said, my brow furrowing. "I mean, I did, but she couldn't." But I knew she could, and as the one person with connections to all the key players, she had to be considered a suspect. The cab driver dropped us off near the warehouse and left with his double fare plus a generous tip. Justine and I held hands as we walked down the empty lane. When we reached our destination, she pulled me close and kissed me. I held her in my arms, squeezing her, eyeing her longingly. "I've missed you," I said.
"Me too,"
she replied, before kissing me again. The roll shutter rose suddenly, startling us both. We stepped back from each other. I turned to see Mobot in the doorway.
"If you kids are going to leave for a secret assignation, you need to let a grown-up know," she said. "I've been worried about you."
"We went to see Matteo," I revealed. "He says he was knocked unconscious before the shooting." Mobot looked surprised.
"He didn't say anything because he was worried Brambilla might have taken his own life, which would deny him a Catholic burial and a proper place in the hereafter,"
Justine said.
"That puts everyone at the party firmly in the frame,"
said Mobot.
"I mean, we'd been working on that assumption, but he just confirmed it either had to be Brambilla or one of the other guests."
I nodded. Justine suggested Luna Colombo. Mobot shrugged.
"I can see why."
"We need to take another look at things," I said. "Figure out a plan of action. We'll regroup in the morning." I moved to pass her. Right now, I'm beat. She stood aside. Weary from the day's events, I made my way through the warehouse and up to the apartment with Justine and Mobot following. I longed to be alone with Justine, but the stolen moments we just shared were as good as it was going to get for now. I leaned close and kissed her. "Night," I said, and she replied in kind. Feeling professionally and personally frustrated, I retreated to the bedroom I shared with Sai. I didn't manage to fall asleep until the first fingers of dawn reached into the room. Chapter 90. My uneasy dreams were a kaleidoscope of images of the dead. The priests, Lombardi, Altmer, Fathers Brambilla and Diaz careening through my mind, making me feel as though I was spinning out of control, way, way out of my depth. I woke with a start and saw sunshine edging the drapes, and sat up to find Sai's bed was empty. I could hear low voices coming from beyond the door, and the rhythmic clatter of cutlery and plates. I pulled on a sky-blue shirt and navy trousers and went out in search of the others. Sai, Mobot, and Fatima were having breakfast at the kitchen table. Sai had loaded his plate with waffles and was drenching them in syrup. I eyed the stack in amazement. "What?" he asked defensively. "Hanging around with you is going to get me killed long before anything sugary or fattening does." Fatima and Mobot smiled. "Is Justine still asleep?" I asked, and Mobot nodded.
"Your nocturnal adventure must have tired her out."
"What nocturnal adventure? Or shouldn't I ask?" Sai said. "We went to see Matteo," I explained. "He told us he was knocked out. So instead of him not remembering what happened, it turns out he was actually unconscious. He thought it was Father Brambilla and didn't tell us, in case the authorities declared it was suicide." "Why the heck would that matter?" Sai asked, taking a bite. "It's a Catholic thing," I replied. "Morning," Justine said. She was dressed in shorts and a matching gray t-shirt. It was one of her favorite pajama sets. "Morning," I replied, going over to kiss her. "Waffles?" Sai asked.
"No," she replied, "but I'd love coffee."
"Scooch over," Mobot said to Sai, making space for Justine and me to bring our chairs up to the table.
"Morning,"
Fatima said.
"So if Matteo is telling the truth, someone else could have killed Father Brambilla. Someone else who was at the party."
I nodded. Someone who was nimble enough to get in and out of that room without being noticed. Sai poured Justine and me freshly made coffee.
"Altmer was at the party, right?"
Fatima asked.
"What if he kills Brambilla and someone else takes out Altmer?"
"Or it was Luna Colombo," Justine suggested.
"Wow,"
Fatima replied.
"Of course. Maybe."
"They have to be our prime suspects," I said. "We need to know what Altmer was doing at the bank, how he was connected to the Dark Fates. And I'm going to talk to Elia Antonelli and find out what he and his daughter have really been up to. Stefano Trotta was at their house and then turned up at the Inferno bar. What do they know about him? What does Luna know about Brambilla's death?"
"I'd like to talk to Trotta directly, if that's okay," Mobot said. "See if my old friend and I can put the squeeze on him."
"Old friend?" Sai responded, still tucking into his waffle stack. "Speak for yourself. I'm a vigorous young go-getter."
"Positively teenage,"
Mobot teased. "Sounds like a plan," I said, sipping my coffee. "You and Sai check out Trotta. Justine and Fatima, go to Vatican City and see what you can find out about Altmer. Ask Joseph Stadler to give you access to whatever records you need. And I'm going out to Antonelli's family farm to ask the old gangster and his daughter some difficult questions."
Chapter 91. "You think we'll get to do some sightseeing when this is over?" Sai asked. Mobot looked at him incredulously. "Bodies piling up, and you're thinking about booking tours," she replied. "Just focus on the road." He was driving the Maserati they'd borrowed from Valentina. "I love Rome," Sai protested. "It's such a beautiful city." Mobot rolled her eyes. Decades of working serious crime, analyzing scenes and hunting criminals, had robbed the job of some of its drama, but she still wasn't as blasé about it as Sai. "You can go out to play when all this is over," she said in a patronizing tone. I'm not a child, you know, he remarked as he signaled for a right turn, but that would be nice. Mobot knew something had happened to Trotta the moment they rounded the corner and joined Via Matronio. The wide, leafy residential avenue ran alongside the Basilica di San Giovanni a Porta Latina and the old missionary college, both buildings surrounded by ancient, high brick walls. On the other side of the street stood luxury apartment blocks and grand old villas, surrounded by mature trees that reached high toward the sun. The road was blocked by police patrol cars, vans, and unmarked vehicles. There were local residents in the gardens of the neighboring mansions and apartment blocks, watching events, and a small crowd of passers-by gathered by the wall of the basilica. The high branches shaded them from the burning sun. If it hadn't been for the clear indications that something was very wrong, Mobot would have been focused on the beauty and architectural history of the stunning street. Sai pulled up behind a row of parked cars. "This probably isn't good," he said. "I'll see what I can find out," Mobot replied. "Same," he said, reaching for the holdall on the back seat. "I'll take a look inside." Mobot felt stifled by the humid air the moment she left the air-conditioned car. She scanned the crime scene, centered on Stefano Trotta's house, and saw someone she recognized. Mia Esposito was talking to some plainclothes officers. Mobot walked over, but a uniformed officer at the cordon prevented her from getting too close. "Inspector!" she yelled. "Inspector Esposito!" She registered her name, glanced at Mobot, and immediately frowned. She excused herself from her colleagues and walked over. "What's happened here?" Mobot asked. Esposito said nothing. "Listen, I'm the one who should be upset," Mobot said. "You arrested me. Wrongfully." Still nothing. "Is Stefano Trotta dead?" Mobot tried. "How would you know that?" Esposito countered. "I don't know. That's why I'm asking you," Mobot replied. "Instead of you asking me questions, I should be asking you about the whereabouts of Jack Morgan. Did he send you here?" Whatever was in that house, it hadn't put Esposito in a good mood. "You tried that already, remember? When you held us without charge," Mobot retaliated. Esposito bristled. "I didn't mean any discourtesy, Inspector," Mobot remarked, checking her own frustration. "I can see you're busy." She backed away. Esposito scowled at her before returning to her colleagues. When Mobot joined Sai on a patch of grass by the basilica wall, she saw he was piloting a tiny drone through Trotta's villa. The screen on the remote control gave them eyes on the interior. There in the living room was Stefano Trotta's body. He was seated on a large couch, gun in hand, an apparent suicide. "Grim," Mobot observed. "Not a nice way to die," Sai remarked, favoring the exit wound on the side of Trotta's head. Mobot saw him frown and pilot the drone around the room. On screen, the drone was broadcasting a view of a blank wall. "Notice anything?" Sai asked. Mobot shook her head. "Just a wall." And then she understood. No bullet hole to match the position of the exit wound. Sai smiled like an indulgent teacher. "Bingo! There's a large exit wound, meaning there should be a bullet somewhere around here. The fact there isn't one suggests he was killed elsewhere. The ease with which I spotted it means this was either staged in a rush, or it's been put together by someone who knows they can rely on the police not to find the truth. Or doesn't care if they do," Mobot suggested. "This was another murder designed to look like a suicide," Sai said. "Do you think Esposito knows?" Mobot asked. "Either she's in on it, and this is all for show," Sai replied, "or she's too junior to matter and no one cares what she thinks. I don't think she would be deploying all these people if she already knew what really happened." "I should go over and tell her what you found, shouldn't I? Being a good Samaritan and all," Mobot said, relishing the prospect. Chapter 92. Justine's phone rang as she and Fatima crossed St. Peter's Square on their way to the headquarters of the Vatican Bank. She saw it was Mobot and answered the call. "Hey." "Trotta is dead. Murder staged to look like suicide." "Geez," Justine replied. "Whatever this thing is, everyone who touches it ends up dead." "Let's not hope everyone," Mobot said. I've been trying to get hold of Jack. If you reach him before I do, let him know. Will do, Justine responded. And let me know if you get anything from the Vatican. Of course, Justine said before hanging up. Everything okay? Fatima asked. Trotta is dead. Murdered. Fatima shook her head slowly. What the hell is this thing? Why are all these people being killed? Justine was unsure what to make of the journalist next to her. Fatima was clearly whip-smart, diligent, and inventive, but Justine had previously had bad experiences with journalists. Most seemed to value their next story above all else and would willingly toss people into the fire of a smoking hot headline. They passed through the border security checkpoint, walked along Via Sant'Anna, and went inside the rotunda that housed the ancient bank. 10 minutes later, they were being led to Stadler's office by a somber-faced assistant who didn't give her name. When they reached the open-plan room on the top floor, Justine saw what she guessed was Altmer's desk, covered in bouquets of flowers and condolence cards. It had become a small and poignant shrine. She lowered her head as she passed and saw Fatima do the same. They were taken in to see Joseph Stadler, and Justine was surprised to find him with the man Jack had identified as Father Vito, who was in fact Cardinal Vito Peralta. They were seated on a couch near the window. Miss Smith, Miss Salah, Stadler said, crossing the room to greet them. I hope you don't mind, but I've asked Cardinal Peralta to join us. He would like to bring his subterfuge to an end. Subterfuge? Justine asked as she and Fatima sat down opposite the men. I have not been completely honest, Cardinal Peralta said. I'm sorry for your loss, by the way, Fatima interjected. Stadler looked puzzled, and Cardinal Peralta nodded sagely. The loss of Signor Altmer, Fatima explained. It must be a blow. It is, Stadler replied. It has been very difficult. Thank you. Do go on, Your Eminence, Fatima said. Cardinal Peralta nodded. I was not entirely honest with Jack Morgan. I sit on the board of this bank and have suspected for some time that it is being used by someone to launder money. Someone? Justine asked. Criminals, he replied. I have been studying the employees and my fellow clergy who perform various functions here, looking for clues to what's happening. And what have you learned? Fatima asked. Christian Altmer was doing business with a man called Milan Verde, Cardinal Peralta revealed. I believe Verde works for an organized crime figure called Elia Antonelli. Justine shot Fatima a look of concern. Cardinal Peralta had just confirmed her worst fears about the man Jack was on his way to confront. After Signor Altmer died, we discovered secret records that show money being transferred to criminal and extremist groups around the world. Money that seems to have originated from Milan Verdi, and ultimately, I suspect, Elia Antonelli. Can you show us these records? Justine asked. Of course, Cardinal Peralta replied, getting to his feet. Follow me.
Chapter 93. Amr Badawi had rustled up a Kawasaki KX250 dirt bike, painted lime green. I rode in jeans, a leather jacket, and an opaque helmet so I wouldn't be recognized on the streets of Rome. I kept to the speed limit throughout the city, but pushed the bike once I was in the tinder-dry hills. As I roared round the broad sweeping bends that took me toward Casape, I reflected on Antonelli and wondered whether I'd misjudged the man. A mob boss had to be a consummate liar and cheat. He had to mask his intentions and dispose of people without hesitation. Why'd I been taken in by the guy? I turned off the winding lane onto the track that led to Antonelli's old family farm. When I reached the low stone wall that demarcated the boundary, I saw a new squad of guards who waved me down. Brandishing their weapons like a platoon of twitchy mercenaries, they made me remove my helmet and confiscated my bike, wallet, keys, and phone. My heart thundered, but I didn't think they would harm me, not without Antonelli's explicit approval. My instincts proved to be right. Soon an old Land Rover Defender roared up, and I was pushed onto the back seat and driven up to the farmhouse. I was taken round the back of the old building to the grand terrace, where Luna and Antonelli sat drinking coffee. The view of rows of olive trees rolling across the valley was simply beautiful. If I'd had his resources, I'd have retired to spend the rest of my days in this very spot. But like a shark, I suspected that if Antonelli didn't keep hunting, he'd die. "Mr. Morgan," he said, without standing, "perhaps we should get you a room in the house." He smiled. "I'm joking, of course. You're very welcome. Please sit." He gestured to the chair opposite Luna's, and it was hard not to be taken in by his genial host act. I found myself warming to the man again, despite everything I knew about him. "What brings you out here this fine day?" he asked. I opened my mouth to answer, but at that very moment my phone rang, vibrating in the hands of one of the men who'd brought me here. "May I?" I asked Antonelli, and he nodded. I took my phone and saw it was Justine calling. "Hey," I said when I answered.
"Jack, where have you been?"
"I was on the bike," I replied. Then I lost my phone for a while.
"Stefano Trotta is dead," she revealed. "Murder, staged as suicide."
I looked at Antonelli and wondered if he'd ordered the head. "I understand," I said. "I'll be in touch." I hung up. As I slid the phone onto the table, Antonelli said, "Problem?" I thought about playing dumb, but there was nothing to be gained. "Stefano Trotta is dead," I replied. "Murder." Antonelli's smile fell. Even the beige linen suit he wore seemed to darken as his face clouded over. "You must be mistaken," he said. I shook my head. "My people don't make mistakes about this kind of thing." He and Luna exchanged fearful glances.
"We should leave,"
she said, and he nodded. "Why? What do you have to be afraid of?" I asked. Antonelli glared at me.
"Is that why you're here? Even after all you've seen and heard, you still think I'm behind this?"
He got to his feet and issued commands to his men. We hurried around the house to the Land Rover. The tallest of the trio of bodyguards got behind the wheel and gunned the engine. "Switch it off," I said, as Antonelli and Luna climbed in the back. The driver looked at Antonelli for confirmation. When his boss nodded, he killed the powerful engine. I stood half in, half out of the car and strained to hear in the sudden silence. Then came the sound I hoped I'd imagined beneath the noise of the engine, the crack and pop of distant gunfire, likely silenced weapons. Someone was on their way to finish the old gangster, and I saw from their fearful expressions that Antonelli and Luna had heard the shooting too. "Let's go," I said, jumping into the cab. "Now!" The driver started the engine, stepped on the accelerator, and the powerful old SUV rolled out of the courtyard. Chapter 94. We were racing along the track toward the estate boundary. The driver and another of Antonelli's men were in the front. Antonelli, Luna, and a third man were in the back, and I was in the trunk space on one of the bench seats, being bounced around over every rut and pothole. "Who's behind this?" I asked. Antonelli turned to answer, but his breath became a gasp when dozens of bullets peppered the windshield, shattering it. I looked beyond him to see a team of men strafing the vehicle with machine guns. They stood behind a low wall that had concealed them as we approached. My guess was the earlier gunshots had been the sound of them killing Antonelli's perimeter guards. "Get down!" I yelled, pushing him and Luna toward their footwells. They ducked, but the driver and front passenger weren't so lucky. Their bodies bucked as the windshield collapsed, and they were riddled with bullets. The large SUV veered off the road, and I braced for impact as a tree suddenly loomed ahead. The Land Rover smashed into the trunk at full pelt. I was hurled against the back seat, the impact winding me. "Is everyone okay?" I asked, the moment I could suck in a breath. Antonelli and Luna were dazed, and so was the man beside them, but he didn't have the sense to stay in the vehicle. "Stop!" I yelled, as he opened the door and staggered out. I tried to grab him, but he was beyond my reach. He stumbled forward, blood oozing down his face from a head wound, fumbling for a pistol in his waistband. As he drew it, the men who'd forced the car off the road came over the brow of a rise nearby and opened fire. The third man got one shot away before he danced to the buck and kick of each bullet that struck him. I didn't have time to mourn the unfortunate stranger, but climbed over the back seat to join the others. "Do something," Antonelli pleaded with me. "If I get you out of this, you will tell me the truth. Everything you know," I said, before slamming the door shut. "Yes, yes," he exclaimed, his voice almost breaking. "Anything." I climbed into the front of the SUV, opened the driver's door, and pushed the dead man out. I jumped in his seat. Glancing in the rear view, I saw the team of gunmen running toward us and prayed the defender's reputation for reliability was justified. I turned the ignition and the engine spluttered. A volley of shots hit the back door, thudding into the metal with enough force to make the vehicle tremble. I tried the key again, and this time the engine roared. I found reverse, backed away from the tree, flipped the car into first, and stepped on the gas. Dust, grass, and stones were flung up by the tires as we raced forward under a hailstorm of bullets. I drove between trees, racing across the dry earth, heading for a dip. The car sped down the hillside. Below us, through a small olive grove, I saw a hedge, and beyond it, a road. I put my foot down and we gathered speed as we bounced across the steep ground. By the time we hit the hedge, we were doing 50. As we flew through it, I stepped on the brake pedal and turned the wheel. The heavy tires screeched and the SUV wobbled as we swerved onto the road. Breathless, veins full of fire and thunder, I glanced over my shoulder and saw clear road behind. I didn't relax for a full 3 minutes, concentrating on putting some distance between us and our attackers. When I looked back again, I saw a shaken Luna and her father had finally begun to breathe more easily. "I think we're okay," I said to Antonelli. "Which means you're going to keep your word and tell me everything you know." Chapter 95. I drove for 10 kilometers before we turned off the road onto an extremely overgrown track that looked as though it hadn't been used for years. We bounced and bumped our way over long grass that grew in tufts along the median, and the suspension rattled and clattered as the wheels encountered hidden rocks and ruts. I didn't stop until we crested a rise and went down the slope on the other side. I turned off the track onto rough terrain and parked in the shade of a cluster of stone pines. I cut the engine and jumped out to ensure we couldn't be seen from the road or any buildings. There was nothing in sight except deserted countryside. I ran over to the Land Rover as Antonelli and his daughter staggered from the vehicle. I opened the passenger door and dragged the dead man out. Antonelli came over as I set the bodyguard gently on the ground. The man's eyes were open, but he would never see the beauty of the branches above him. "Aldo was a good man," Antonelli said, his voice faltering. "They all were." "I'm sorry," I responded. Luna joined us.
"So, what is the truth, Papa?"
Antonelli shrank from her. "I don't know. I didn't mean—" She interrupted him.
"You're not getting out of the deal you made. Mr. Morgan risked his life for us."
Antonelli looked ashamed. For the first time, I saw him as a tired old man rather than a powerful gangster. "You're right, of course," he said, stroking her cheek. "Like your mother always was." He hesitated. "I wish she was still with us. She was a good person."
"Tell him what you know, Papa,"
Luna insisted.
"Tell me."
Antonelli smiled. "I could never refuse my girl. I am a founding member of Propaganda Tre. It was started after the fall of the Berlin Wall to protect this country against anti-Christian socialist ideologies."
"Oh, Papa,"
Luna said, her disappointment so intense I could almost feel it in the air around us.
I'm sorry, Luna. I was young. I thought I knew what was good for Italy, for Rome, for us. I found myself allied to wicked men with ambitions and plans they did not share with me. Secret plans, dishonest plans. I thought our group would be different, not like Propaganda 2, but it wasn't. We lost our way.
His voice trailed off. And? I prompted.
We got involved with espionage, extremist groups. Like our predecessors, we laundered money, financed terror all around the world, drifting further and further toward an ideology I didn't recognize. Not left or right, but one that worships only money.
Why didn't you tell me? Luna asked.
Because he was worried you'd feel it was your duty to investigate, I replied for him. And that would have put your life in danger. Antonelli nodded.
I swore an oath of loyalty, he said. A blood oath. Any betrayal or attempt to leave the organization will result in death. Not just for the renegade, but for everyone they love.
So what's happening here in Rome? Why the power play? Why have so many died, some of them men of God? I asked.
I don't know,
he replied.
That's the thing. I just don't know what's going on. I asked Rota to pay Milan Verde a visit to see if he could find out who the Dark Fates are working for. Milan is a psychopath. He's ruthless but doesn't have the ambition to play at this level, so he's working for someone higher up.
Do you know the other members of Propaganda 3? I asked.
Only the ones in my chapter,
Antonelli replied.
Now Trotta is dead, so is Christian Altmar, and...
Altmar? I exclaimed. He was in Propaganda 3? Antonelli nodded.
As is his boss, Joseph Stadler.
I was dumbfounded and took a moment to absorb this revelation. What about Cardinal Vito Peralta? I asked when I found my voice.
Yes, the church is represented.
I paced around for a moment. What if Stadler didn't hire Private to solve the case? What if he hired us in order to keep tabs on what we were doing? He knew I'd look into Father Brambilla's death, and I represented a risk to the organization if I was doing things they weren't aware of. By hiring us, he could share what we found, enabling him to gauge the threat of Propaganda 3 being exposed. I hadn't had the chance to make any formal interim reports to Stadler, but I looked back on my informal meetings with our client and thought about all the useful information he would have gleaned from them. Each meeting with him had happened before an attack or an encounter with someone who'd led me into a trap. After our first meeting, Luna and I were shot at by the assassin who tried to kill us out near Poli. I hadn't made the connection before, but if Stadler was behind everything, those incidents hadn't been coincidences. I took out the new phone Mobot had given me and connected to private secure server. I sent a message to Justine, Mobot, and Sai. We need to meet. Parco di Monteciochi, near Vatican City. 2 hours. I pocketed the phone and turned to Antonelli. You could have saved us a lot of time if you'd shared the truth of your involvement with this group sooner.
I'm sorry. The oath. They would kill me and my daughter. I thought I could handle it. I thought I could...
Luna cut him off.
Could what? Kill someone? Buy someone off? How can we share the same blood? These are bad things. The way you live your life, the way you make your money, the people you associate with, the things you've done.
Luna, Antonelli pleaded, but she left him nowhere to go.
I'm sorry, Papa. I can't look away anymore. I can't pretend. Your business goes against God and man,
she said.
To be under your protection is to be aligned with you. I cannot agree to live my life like that.
She faced me.
Are you going back to Rome?
I nodded.
Will you deal with this Stadler?
I nodded again.
Then take me with you. I want to help. I want to see him face justice.
I admired her bravery and couldn't believe that only a short while ago I thought she might be in league with her father,
and responsible for Father Brambilla's murder. "What about me?" Antonelli asked.
Luigi Callio's farm is over that hill. He has always been loyal. Stay with him and his family until this is over,"
Luna replied. She walked back to the Land Rover and got in the driver's side. "Come on," she said to me.
"What about us?"
Antonelli asked pathetically.
"We'll talk when this is over,"
his daughter told him. He looked broken, but I didn't feel sorry for him. Luna was right. His dishonesty had cost lives. I got in the Defender. Luna said nothing as she started the engine. She eyed her father, who seemed much diminished, standing hunched and dejected in the deserted landscape, a dead man lying close by. She kept her eyes fixed on him in the mirror as she turned the car around, and we began our return to Rome. Chapter 96. We left the track and turned onto Via Roma, a winding country road that would eventually take us back to the city. Soon we were making good progress. "You didn't know anything about your father's membership of this group?" I asked. Luna shook her head.
"He never speaks to me about his business activities. He's always said it's because he doesn't want to put me in a difficult position. But maybe it's because he felt he couldn't trust me. So there was a big blank space between us. I mean, I had my suspicions. Through my work, I've been able to connect some of the dots. His low-life associates and street-level operations are known to me, places like the Pleasure Hall. But this propaganda tray connection was kept from me. Or it was until today."
She sounded convincing, but someone who'd been born into the mob and had to conceal the truth from her colleagues every single day would be an accomplished liar. "Must be difficult, you being police, him doing what he does." She nodded.
"Very. But families are sent to test us. Love us, but test us."
I smiled. Her expression didn't soften. We headed along the valley toward Colle Marellino, a tiny village tucked behind the intersection of two highways. We would join one of them, the Autostrada Roma, and head west into the city. The country road we were on, the Via di San Vittorino, followed a curve around the shoulder of a tree-covered hill before it narrowed to pass through a tunnel bored through a low cliff. When we emerged into dazzling sunshine, I sensed movement. As my eyes adjusted, I saw the flash of a vehicle speeding beyond some trees, coming along Via Palenze toward the intersection we were approaching. It was a large dump truck traveling flat out. The driver showed no intention of slowing. In fact, he was clearly aiming to hit us. "Luna!" I yelled. "Stop!" But it was too late. The truck collided with the Defender, mangling the front of the Land Rover, smashing through the engine block, sending us into a terrible, grinding, crashing spin. The cabin filled with smoke, diesel, the stench of burning metal, scorched rubber, and the world went round and round like a waltzer in a giant hall of mirrors. My head collided with the side window, which shattered. Everything went distant. I was dimly aware of us bouncing off the truck, but still traveling with it, metal caught and hooked on metal as we spun wildly. Then stillness. Suddenly movement, hands pulling me, thrown onto my back. Above me, snarling unfamiliar faces, tattoos. The dark fates. A familiar face. Milan Verde. Above his bitter, cynical smile, hovering in the sky, was the drone they'd used to follow us from Antonelli's farmhouse. Milan Verde lashed out with his boot, and the last thing I saw was his dirty soul filling my vision. Chapter 97. I was tumbling through time and space, haunted by the dead from Afghanistan to London, Los Angeles to Moscow. Time out of joint, as it only is in dreams. "Lo incastreremo per la morte di Antonelli," a voice said from somewhere.
"Attento che potrebbero sentirti,"
another responded. "I don't care if they hear me or he understands me," the original speaker said. In fact, I will say it in English to be sure he can. We will frame him for Antonelli's death. I realized these speakers weren't among the many specters in my mind. The words had come from another place, the real world that I'd momentarily left behind. I opened my eyes to blinding flashes of pain and dazzling light. "We just need the go-ahead," the same voice said. As my eyes adjusted, I realized the light wasn't dazzling. It was in fact quite low. I just happened to have been facing a wall-mounted spotlight when I opened my eyes. I was in a room made of stone. There were no windows, only uplighters lining the walls, and between each pair of lights was an alcove containing a stone seat. The air had a cool, still quality that made me think I was in a cellar. I was seated on a chair in the middle of a space about the size of a tennis court. I tried to move and found that both arms and legs were bound to the chair. There were 5 guys in front of me. I recognized them from the Inferno bar. Leading the pack of devils was Milan Verde, who prowled closer when he saw I was awake. "I'm going to enjoy this," he said, slapping me. "Wake up properly, Mr. Morgan." The sting of his palm against my face revived me further and got my heart pumping. We're predictable creatures, and pain coupled with the prospect of violence sent adrenaline coursing through my body. My fingers searched out my bonds, and I was relieved to feel cord rather than steel. I couldn't see the knot, but tracked the familiar path of a bowline with my fingertips. It wouldn't be difficult to slip. I got to work on it immediately. "Should we kill them now?" one of Milan's associates asked. He was looking beyond me. I glanced over my shoulder and saw Elia Antonelli and Luna Colombo, bound and gagged, fear in their eyes. "Not yet," Milan said, pulling out his phone and making a call. He had a simple message for whoever was at the other end of the line. "He's awake." Chapter 98. A few minutes later, I heard a door open directly behind me. I tried to look round, but it was outside my field of view. Milan stepped forward and slapped me. "Eyes front, American." I glared at him. He was the type who would feed off signs of pain. There were footsteps behind me, and Joseph Stadler walked into view. He wore a finely tailored suit, shirt and tie, and looked as though he had just come from a cocktail party. "Mr. Morgan," he said, "who have you told about what you know?" I didn't respond. I focused on the knot binding my wrists and kept working it loose with the tips of my fingers. "You and your associates here must die." I heard muffled objections from Luna and Antonelli. "But first I need to know how big a problem I face. Do your colleagues also need attention? Miss Smith, for example?" Fury must have shone in my eyes. "She means something to you, more than the others do," Stadler said, moving closer. "Well, we can work with that. If you tell me what I need to know, if you give me assurances, I will give you her life." I knew no deal with this man would be worth the words wasted on it. "You killed Brambilla," I said. "When he arrived at the party, he saw you. He saw that you saw him too, and you both knew why he was there. To tell Matteo what you were doing, using the bank to launder money for criminals. For Milan Verdi and Elia Antonelli and other members of your secret group, Propaganda 3. He knew you'd been killing the priests, that you'd killed Filippo Lombardi, and he wanted to do the right thing as a good man to ease his conscience. He was going to give Matteo the whole story, so you had to act. That's why his death was unlike the others. It was spontaneous. You killed him to prevent him talking." Stadler smiled. "Well done, Mr. Morgan. I followed them, waited until I was sure no one could see, went into the room, and used the pistol I always carry to stun Matteo." "And then you shot Father Brambilla," I remarked. Did you pretend to use the restroom, join the crowd as it gathered, or slip out of the staff entrance and come in through one of the terrace doors?" "Staff entrance," Stadler replied. "It really wasn't difficult. Like this, being here with you, none of this is difficult for me. You know, after I listened to Father Brambilla beg for a while, I made him a similar deal to the one I am offering you. The truth for Matteo's life. Father Brambilla told me he hadn't shared our secret with anyone else, and he gave me that comfort so Matteo could live. But when I reported to you what Matteo had been investigating, you decided to have him killed in police custody," I suggested. "Because you realized he wasn't just some friend Father Brambilla had chosen to confide in, and you were worried Father Brambilla had lied to you and told him everything." "Correct," Stadler confirmed. "Well done, Mr. Morgan. Your deductive powers came good in the end. I was worried your reputation wasn't justified." "And the other priests?" I asked. "Why kill them?" "Your questions are at an end, Mr. Morgan," Stadler replied. He turned to Milan Verde. "Kill him, and them." He pointed at Luna and Antonelli. "Kill them all." Chapter 99. Milan stepped forward and drew a Beretta M9 pistol from behind his back. As he raised it toward my temple, I gave a final tug on the bowline loop binding my wrists, worked my right hand free, and grabbed the gun. He was so shocked he took a step back, but I held fast and the gun stayed in my hand. I spun it quickly and shot him in the knee. As he went down, crying out in agony, I pointed the weapon at Stadler. "Move, and he dies," I told the 5 members of the Dark Fates, who were all reaching for their weapons. I kept the gun steady on Stadler as I undid the cord at my feet and was relieved when I was finally able to stand. Milan was rolling around on the floor, groaning in pain. "I'll ask you again," I said, stepping toward Stadler, brandishing the gun. "Why all the dead priests?" A shot rang out, and I was struck by what felt like a hammer blow to my shoulder. I fell on my back, gasping with shock, and the Beretta clattered across the stone floor. I raised my head to see who'd shot me, and was shocked when Cardinal Vito Peralta emerged from a shadowed alcove beside the heavy wooden door. He wasn't wearing his customary robe, but was instead in a dark suit and clerical collar.
"The priests were couriers we used to move money around," he said. "Each of them could have implicated Joseph and me in criminal activities. We gave them their instructions directly. They were the only witnesses to our sins who weren't criminals or members of propaganda trade themselves. They posed a threat to our plans."
"What plans?"
"Elevation,"
Cardinal Peralta said. "To becoming Pope," I guessed. "To running the Vatican Bank," I suggested, looking at Stadler. My initial shock was wearing off, and my shoulder was burning with fiery agony. "That's what this was about? Ambition? Power?" I asked, surprised by how weak my voice sounded. I caught Antonelli's eye, and he gave me a knowing look. It was the ancient Roman pursuit he'd spoken of.
"God created man, Mr. Morgan,"
Cardinal Peralta replied.
"Why would he have given us ambition if we weren't meant to use it? With 8 billion of us on this planet, do we really have to worry about the loss of a handful of priests? They served the cause and fulfilled their heavenly purpose."
His words were monstrous, a betrayal of our common faith. I wondered how many warning signs had been ignored over the years. How many people had seen the hunger for power in this man's eyes and been unable to do anything about it? Unchecked evil would only grow, and these 2 men planned to take control of one of the oldest institutions in the world and use it to further their own warped objectives and the aims of their corrupt group. I couldn't allow that to happen. I eyed the fallen pistol. If I could just reach it, I would take my chances with a left-handed shot. Cardinal Peralta stepped forward.
You wouldn't get to it in time. Your destiny was written by God before the first light flashed into existence. You will die here tonight, your reputation forever destroyed after you murdered Elia Antonelli and Luna Colombo, because your organization became involved with his criminal enterprises. Your colleagues in Rome, including Miss Smith, will all join you soon.
He raised his weapon, and I held my breath. I had to move now. I pictured myself lunging for the Beretta and tensed, ready to pounce. The unbearable swell of expectation was punctured by the sound of my phone ringing. It was on the floor by the chair I'd been bound to. Stadler looked down at it.
"Justine,"
he said.
"Maybe we can convince her to tell us where they are,"
Cardinal Peralta said.
"Or get her to come here."
"Don't," I said, but Stadler picked up the phone and answered the call.
"Hello?"
he said.
"Miss Smith?" "She wants to be on speaker,"
he explained shortly afterwards. "Justine, no," I said. But Stadler silenced me with a kick, and Cardinal Peralta pressed the barrel of his gun against Luna's temple and eyed me menacingly.
"I want to talk to Cardinal Peralta,"
Justine said.
"I want him to hear what I have to say. Check your right lapel, Cardinal."
Peralta looked down, and as his eyes widened, I realized I'd missed something incredibly important. There, clinging to his lapel, was one of our microdrones.
"We used Jack's phone to find him when he didn't show up for our meeting,"
Justine revealed.
"We couldn't get the drone into the cellar until you and Mr. Stadler arrived. We flew it in with you. It has been streaming live footage to the internet ever since you set foot in that room."
Cardinal Peralta was horrified. Horror quickly turned to rage. I knew what was coming and sprang as he turned his gun on me. I grabbed the Beretta, rolled over, and shot the Cardinal in the gut twice before he could pull the trigger. The wooden door exploded in a storm of splinters, and I recognized some of Antonelli's men as they ran through the dust and smoke, brandishing machine guns. They yelled at the Dark Fates in Italian, and Milan Verde's men had the good sense to realize they were beaten. I hauled myself to my feet and walked over to Peralta, who lay bleeding on the stone floor. "It's over," I said. "You and your friends," I gestured at Milan Verde and Joseph Stadler, "will face justice. You will have years to consider how you've betrayed your faith."
"Jack."
I glanced round to see Justine, Sai, Mobot, and Fatima enter. I hobbled over to Justine, and we embraced and kissed. She felt me wince.
"Oh my God,"
she said.
"You need a doctor."
I kissed her again. "You have no idea how good it is to see you." I looked at Fatima, Sai, and Mobot. "All of you. I'm already feeling so much better." Chapter 100. Fate put me in the same place as Matteo Ricci, in Fette Bene Fratelli Hospital on the Isola Tiberina, in a private room tucked away under the eaves. Justine, Mobot, and Sai came to visit me during my 5-day stay. Cardinal Peralta had shot me in the shoulder, but the bullet had passed through muscle and bone and hadn't harmed anything vital. Although it was painful and my mobility would be impaired for a while, my prognosis was good. I was also visited by Inspector Mia Esposito, who wanted my testimony and details of everything we'd uncovered during our investigation. No amount of power or money could save Cardinal Peralta or Joseph Stadler. In fact, Stadler was feeling so much pressure from the police, there was already talk of him doing a deal with the prosecutor, giving up Propaganda 3 in exchange for a shorter prison sentence. On my 5th day in the hospital, as the warm summer wind was blowing over the Tiber and in at my open attic window, bringing with it the glorious rich smells of the city, Dr. Farid Jalili entered, a frown on his face, a chart and pen held in his hand. He made a point of studying my records, but I knew it was for show. I had taken a shine to the charismatic, funny doctor.
"It's good news, Mr. Morgan."
He broke into a grin.
"It looks like you're fit to go. I can discharge you."
That's really great, I said, getting to my feet. I hadn't been up much since my admission, except for short trips to the bathroom, and it took me a moment for me to steady myself. Thank you, Dr. Jalili. You and your team have been amazing.
You're welcome, Mr. Morgan. Try not to get shot again.
He left the room. In the closet beside the bed, I found fresh clothes Justine had brought over during a visit. I put on a dark blue suit and white shirt, taking great care to properly fit the sling they'd given me to support my injured shoulder. The black shoes were the most difficult thing to manage, but despite working one-handed, I succeeded in the end. I made a call on the new phone Mobot had given me.
Justine, it's me.
Yeah, they gave me the all-clear.
Thanks. I'll wait for you outside.
I hung up, excited to see her and our friends. I'd originally planned to wait on the bridge in front of the hospital and watch the river go by, but after thanking the ward staff, I took the stairs down to Matteo's room. He was lying in bed when I walked in.
Jack,
he said.
How's the shoulder?
I get to keep it, I replied. He smiled, though it didn't last long.
If you want my resignation, I won't be happy to give it, but I'll understand why.
I was silent for a moment. It's clear to me you made a couple of bad judgment calls, but none of us is perfect, I replied. Once you're on your feet, I would like you to finish setting up the Rome office. You have the necessary skills and experience to make Private Rome exceptional. Matteo nodded, and his smile returned.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you so much.
Chapter 101. After leaving Matteo, I went outside and waited on the bridge in front of the hospital. I was relieved and happy when Sai, Mobot, and Justine arrived in a taxi. Justine jumped out of the vehicle and ran to me, but stopped when I took a step back warily.
I'm sorry,
she said.
I almost forgot.
She embraced me on my good side, avoiding my bullet wound, and we kissed. It felt so great to be reunited with her, and the smile on her lips told me she felt exactly the same way. Sai and Mobot greeted me warmly when I joined them in the cab. The driver took us through the eternal city to the Hassler, which had been my home when I'd first arrived in Rome. It was a relief not to be looking over my shoulder, watching for danger at every turn. After spending the afternoon in our suite, where we could finally be alone, Justine and I went to meet Sai and Mobot in the hotel's rooftop bar and restaurant for pre-dinner drinks. We entered the busy space to find our colleagues sitting with Fatima Salah. The tenacious journalist had filed stories that had given her readers the inside scoop on Propaganda 3, the dark fates, and the role of Joseph Stadler and Cardinal Peralta in laundering money for these groups. It was proving to be one of the most sensational scandals in modern Italian history, implicating government ministers like the deceased Stefano Trotta, financiers, mob bosses, and clergy.
Hello, Mr. Morgan,
Fatima said, as Justine and I joined them at their table. You know, you can call me Jack, I replied, wincing slightly as I caught myself at a bad angle while taking my seat.
Are you okay?
Fatima and Justine said simultaneously. Jinx, Mobot teased. I'm fine, thanks, I replied. Just need to get used to taking it easy.
You did well,
Fatima said.
You all did.
So did you, Sai replied. I see your stories being covered everywhere. You did great, I said. In fact, Private is still looking for a second-in-command for the Rome office. Fatima smiled.
That's very kind, Jack, but I'm a journalist, not a detective. I have an obligation to my readers, and quite frankly, I don't like the idea of being shot at all the time.
It's not all the time, Sai replied. Just on weekdays. Everyone chuckled. The maitre d' approached.
Your table is ready, Mr. Morgan.
If you won't join our company, at least keep us company for dinner, I said to Fatima. She nodded.
It would be my pleasure.
Chapter 102. The following morning, we packed what luggage we had and loaded it into the back of the silver Range Rover Vogue the hotel had provided as an airport shuttle. Mobat sat beside the driver, an older man with thinning gray hair, a warm smile, and mischievous eyes. Justine, Cy, and I were in the back, and I didn't pay much attention to what was happening until I realized we weren't heading toward the airport. "Excuse me," I said to the driver. "Yes? Where are we going?" "Signor Antonelli would like to show his thanks to you before you leave Rome," the driver replied, as calmly as if he was giving us a weather update. I'd no idea how Antonelli had subverted a hotel driver, or how he knew about our travel plans, but he was one of the most powerful men in Rome, and for now was free from threat or worries, because he had somehow been able to conceal his association with Propaganda 3. His reach must go very high indeed. He certainly seemed happy when I saw him standing with Luna in the car park at the end of Via Sant'Anna in Vatican City. "I hope you don't mind," he said as we all stepped out of the SUV.
Sorry, Mr. Morgan,
Luna added as we approached.
He likes grand gestures.
"What is wrong with a grand gesture to the people who saved our lives?" he asked. "Come, there's someone I want you to meet." He led us through the brick archway onto Via Sant'Anna, and we walked along the ancient road to the Papal Palace near the Vatican Bank.
"We're going to meet the Pope, aren't we?"
Mobat remarked. She wasn't Catholic, but for some reason the prospect clearly excited her. I wasn't so eager to be confronted by God's representative on earth. My own feelings about my faith were unclear, and hadn't been helped by the discovery that an institution like the Church had been used by evil men to spread their poison. Thankfully, once we passed through security, we were shown into the vast and opulent office of Cardinal Sala, the Pope's personal representative. Unlike Cardinal Peralta, Cardinal Sala wore the customary royal purple, but with no air of vanity or pomp. When his assistant showed us in, the Cardinal rose from his desk and greeted us warmly.
"Mr. Morgan, Miss Smith, Miss Roth, Mr. Kloppenberg, the Church owes you a great debt. His Eminence, the Holy Father, has asked me to convey his gratitude."
I nodded.
"You're welcome. The Church will, of course, honor your engagement and pay any bills you present in relation to this investigation."
"Thank you," I replied. I had thought the arrest of our original client would result in this being a pro bono case, so was relieved to know the Vatican would make good. The Cardinal offered us tea, which we took on a grand balcony overlooking the Fontana dei Delfini, decorated with statues of dolphins and set in a beautiful ornamental garden. We discussed the most superficial and polite aspects of the case. After 20 minutes, we took our leave and returned to the parking lot to find the Range Rover waiting where we had left it. "Thank you, Mr. Morgan," Antonelli said, embracing me. "I owe you much." He smiled at Luna. When I'd started this investigation, I could never have imagined it would end with me putting our client behind bars and being hugged and thanked by one of the biggest criminals in Rome.
"I'm going to convince him to retire,"
Luna said in my ear as she embraced me.
"Thank you for keeping us alive."
"You're welcome," I replied. "I hope you succeed in getting him to spend more time farming olives and baking bread." She grinned.
"I'll try my best."
The two of them said farewell to Justine, Cy, and Mobat, and we all climbed back into the climate-controlled luxury SUV. "Ready?" the driver asked. I looked at Mobat, Cy, and Justine in turn, and each of them smiled and nodded. "Ready," I replied. "Let's go home."
Belinda hopes you enjoyed the reading of
Private Rome by James Patterson, read by Adam Sims and Rachel Hanshaw.
Our audiobooks are becoming increasingly popular among travelers, families, and people who are on the go. If you really enjoyed this audiobook, introduce your friends and family to the experience. We're sure they'll love you for it. If you want to hear more about our fabulous range of titles, please visit us online at belinda.com. Thanks for listening, and remember to always take a Belinda audiobook with you.
Text copyright James Patterson, 2023. Copyright and recording Penguin Audio 2023. All rights reserved.